Larry Oppenheimer, aka Larry the O. Welcome to Tech Talk with Daniel Albu.
I am delighted to be here with you, Daniel. Looking forward to a nice yak.
I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time, especially since we have some unfinished business regarding the repetitive monkey sounds in Escape from Monkey Island. So hopefully we'll solve this mystery once and for all today. But before we dive into that, let's start at the beginning. How did you get into the field of audio?
I got into the field of audio. Funny you should ask that, because you and I were just talking about this. But I had a formative experience that really was kind of the first thing that pushed me in that direction, which was seeing Pink Floyd at the Kennedy Center in 1972. And they were premiering Dark Side of the Moon. This is months before the album came out. So everybody who was attending had never heard this. Everybody that was attending was mind altered. And they opened with it. And so it was quite the experience. They had a 360-degree sound system. And I was already into music, obviously, but this was one of the first places that sound and what sound could do, to just get inside you, really came home to me. And by the way, years later, I ended up meeting the guy that it turns out had mixed that show, but that's another story. In any event, that was a formative experience that really changed my entire conception of sound and how sound and music can work together, was that. And then from there, what ended up happening was, a year or two later, 73, I think, I went away to college. And I originally went there as a percussion major, but it turns out they had a large electronic music department there. Because at the time, the governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller, was trying to make the New York schools the equivalent of the California schools. So he poured a bunch of money into this new thing of synthesizers. And there was this huge wall-size Moog modular, which is what I learned on. And one of the beautiful things about learning from a Moog modular like that is you're working with the elements of sound. You're working with you have to create the sound by connecting an oscillator to a filter to, an amplifier with an envelope generator. So it really gets ingrained in you how each of these things affects the sound. Learning about modulation, etc. Learning about moving things through space. And I ended up doing a recital there with a friend of mine, and we set up in a little recital hall a quad system. Again, this is by then it was 1974, 75, but still relatively new. And we had brought down some of this Moog modular downstairs with us, and we're playing with sounds in it. So that's kind of how I really got from just being a player to getting into sound design and recording, because at the time it was all tape. From there, I went to Berklee College of Music, and that's when I got directly into audio recording as well as more synthesis. And it just took off from there. That's when I got into music recording, and it went from there. I got into post-production and then finally into games.
Okay, conversation over. Anyway, speaking of the 70s.
There's more to be said, but it's we have a lot to talk about. So
I know. So speaking of the 70s, I want to show you a photo from the 70s. And I want you to tell me everything you can about this photo.
This is actually a really great story. I had a band called Storm. We played some rock and roll covers, and this was the 70s, so we also played some fusion music. Needless to say, this combination of rock and roll and fusion confused almost all audiences, and most people had no idea what to do with it. That particular photo is taken at a club that we used to play in Manchester, New Hampshire, which at the time, and probably still, was a very blue-collar town. And this club was a biker bar, a serious get-down biker bar that technically was known as the American Community Club. That's what it said on the outside. But everybody knew it as the Zoo. And in fact, their bumper stickers. There's still one on a piece of my equipment that says, "Meet me at the Zoo." And so we would go up there and play, and we often would get gigs because if they liked you, they did not throw ashtrays and bottles. If they didn't like you, they did. So we would sometimes, they would typically book bands for Thursday, Friday, Saturday nights. We would sometimes get calls on a Friday from the owner saying, well, the last band, they ran out by the second set. You guys want to come up and do Friday and Saturday night? And so we would go up there and do it. You can barely see behind me, there was this kind of, it wasn't really a mural, but those are all naked women disporting themselves, very idealized naked women. So the whole place was just an amazing it was an amazing place to play. They would have fights all the time, but these were all friends of each other. So they were fighting because bikers like to fight. And they would like tumble around the place. And so we had to bring an extra person to park next to the guy that was mixing sound. So if a couple of guys tumbled their way, he would just kind of give them a little shove and to redirect them into another direction. So, obviously I'm pretty blissed out there in that picture. This picture is also notable because it may well have been the very night I wrote a story. I have a storytelling meets sound art series called Ears Here Now. And this is the second story, the incident. But the first story, which was called Out of Body, Out of Mind, was about one night when we played at the zoo. And all of a sudden I had this bizarre sensation that I was looking at the band and everything was just kind of weird. And then suddenly I was back playing again and just made a mistake immediately. And afterwards I'm like, what the heck was that? What just happened? And the whole way we were driving back to Boston from Manchester, New Hampshire, I was wondering. And I finally concluded this must be what they mean when they say out-of-body experience, because I couldn't come up with any other explanation. And for all I know, it might well have been that very night that you see in the picture that was happening. So that was, at the time I was basically a rock and roll and fusion drummer. I was a student at Berklee College of Music, and I was playing at this biker bar up in Manchester, New Hampshire. It was a pretty crazy time.
So they always called you at the last minute, so you didn't have time to rehearse?
No, not always at the last minute. We'd often book. Usually we would book nights, but sometimes they would call us up and say, "Last band is gone. Do you want the rest of the weekend?" As for rehearsing, we always rehearsed. So if you're a regular gigging band, you know your repertoire pretty well, and it's not difficult to just drop everything and go and play somewhere. Yeah, that was quite a colorful joint.
So in 1979, you started working at Lexicon as a digital audio technician, well before Michael Land and Peter McConnell joined the company. Can you describe your responsibilities in that role?
Well, sure. First of all, again, I had just gotten out of Berklee College and I needed to get a job. And I actually looked in the classified ads. In those days, they had newspapers with classified ads. And there was a classified ad for assemblers, not for technicians, but for guys to solder resistors and chips and all that. And I went in and earlier there had been a huge blizzard in Boston, the blizzard of 78. It had shut down the city. And while the city was shut down, I spent the time in my basement. A friend of mine taught me how to solder, and I soldered together a modular synthesizer, an Aries modular synthesizer from Kits, which still sits right over here, just out of camera range. And so I knew how to solder. And when I went into Lexicon, they just gave me a board and then some components, and they said, let's see if you can solder. And I was able to solder, and I actually even knew how to read the color code on resistors. So I got the job as an assembler. And that's how I started, was as an assembler. And that was fairly amusing in and of itself because I was good at it, because I had an aptitude and all that. And there was another guy who was good at it because his family had owned an electronics shop, an electronics firm in Montserrat. And he and I used to go out at lunch, and we would have fun at lunch. And we'd come back in, and this woman who was basically like a Marine drill sergeant type would see us, and she would just be all disgusted, but we were the best assemblers she had. So she would just bite her tongue. And I fairly quickly, I took a real interest I met a few of the engineers, took a real interest in that. And then I went and started taking night courses at MIT. And they had this wonderful school called Lowell Institute School, which was community oriented. It was aimed specifically at people like me who were working people, working full time, but wanted to advance themselves. And if your company did not provide funding for school, they basically would give you what amounted to a scholarship. And so this is all MIT level teachers, MIT textbooks, the same facilities. The only real difference between that and the daytime was you didn't get as much lab time. So it was a really good electronics education. And so I managed to get myself, become a bench technician at Lexicon. Now, Lexicon actually got going around 1971. That was the earliest commercially available digital audio. And the first piece they ever created was called the Gotham Delta T101, because Gotham put their name on it. And I have one of those sitting here, which I think still works. And that actually is either that or it's immediate successor to the 102, the delay that Pink Floyd used on Dark Side of the Moon.
Wow.
So at the time, they had the newer model and they were trying to get the old models off the road. That's how I ended up with this one, because it was sitting in the back and they were doing nothing with it. And I convinced the president to sell it to me for $25. And then the next day he said, I said that? I'm like, yeah, you did. He goes, the Transformer's worth more than that. Anyway, this was the early days of commercial digital audio. And it was really an amazing education. I mean, the engineers they had there were just, the cutting edge engineers. The day that I started, or the week that I started, they had shipping parties for 2 new products. The Primetime Digital Delay, which is the first digital delay to come out that was specifically designed to do effects and not just to do synchronization delays, and the 224 Digital Reverb, which I also have one of sitting right down there. So I walked in the door exactly as Lexicon was hitting its stride and bringing out its greatest products. And just being around in an atmosphere like that is amazing. The things that you learn and the level of detail that you get to understand about how an A to D converter works. And the amazing thing is all this low-level detail, these little tiny things that are unrelated, come back bit by bit in things like sound design and mixing in ways you would never have thought. And so I was just really fortunate to be in the right place at the right time at Lexicon. And I got involved with the guy that was doing the digital reverb, David Griesinger, who is an amazing character. He was a teacher in low-energy nuclear physics at Harvard. That's what his PhD was in. But he was also a classical musician and a classical recording engineer. And the reason that he invented the Lexicon digital reverb is because he often had to record in these horrible sounding churches in Boston. And he would try to minimize the horrible ambience, and then it was too dry. And he had tried everything to try and get good reverb. He tried going to another nice church or using plate reverb or whatever, and nothing satisfied him. And then he heard about this brand new thing called microcomputers. And he taught himself how to program microcomputers. He breadboarded the circuitry like a 2x4, a piece of plywood with circuitry nailed onto it. And he built this digital reverb. So I'm hanging out with this guy, going out on his recording gigs with him, recording sack butts and all that sort of stuff. And with him explaining acoustics to me. So all of this just was like a foundation for everything that came after. Well, if I was working on a game and a character's walking from one room to the next, I had an understanding of how the sound should change because of my understanding of acoustics that I gained from David Griesinger. I understood occlusion and exactly what that meant long before you could actually have an occlusion parameter, in some game software or something. So I was just very fortunate to be in the right place at the right time and get this real education at the fundamentals that has served me to this day. I did that for 2 or 3 years. And then at that point, I felt like I'd done what I could do at Lexicon and moved on from there.
And was this your first paid position in the field of audio?
It was. That was it. It was actually one of my, other than, selling Christmas cards at a department store as a teenager or something, it was kind of my first real job.
Awesome. So in 1984, you started working as a freelance writer for mix and electronic musician magazines, in addition to writing technical manuals and books. What was your approach when it came to writing technical manuals?
I'll be honest, my approach to writing the articles is actually more interesting. Because the reason that I started writing articles was, as I said, I was really lucky to get this education. And I was reading some of the articles in the trade press at the time. And there was all this new technology that was coming out. And the writers were trying to explain this technology to people that knew nothing about it. And the writers themselves were still just learning about it. And so they would try to simplify what was at that time complex concepts for people to understand. But in the process of simplification, they would often introduce inaccuracies. And they were the sorts of things where when you're reading the article, it didn't matter. But I learned a lot about audio from reading those articles. And if you get down the road and you have this bad piece of information you got 2 years ago, it screws you up down the road. And this ticked me off that, I didn't think that it was necessary to be inaccurate. I thought you could do both. You could make things clear and still be accurate. And so I had gone to a NAMM show, National Association of Music Merchandisers, in Anaheim, and I was shooting my mouth off about this as I was walking around with some people at the show. Unbeknownst to me, the woman I was shooting my mouth off to, who I really didn't know, I was just meeting her for the first time, was the publisher of Mix Magazine. And so she looks at me and she goes, "Oh, you think you can do better?" I said, "Hell yeah, I can do better." And she said, "Fine, here's the phone number for our editor. When you get back, give him a call." And that's how I ended up starting writing. So when I started writing, I had a mission. And my mission was I was going to explain these things in ways that people could understand, but where all the detail was accurate. And it takes a lot of work. You have to do a lot more background research, and you have to be super careful about how you word things, but you can do it. And I got this reputation for writing these long articles. I got a reputation for long articles. But I would always send it to get fact checked to the engineers that I talked to. And rarely did they have a correction. And of course, if they did, I made the correction. So, people would see these articles and they'd start to get an understanding from it. And I'd feel like, okay, they're getting the real information. And the thing that amazes me is at the last NAMM show, January 2024, I was in Anaheim, and this guy comes up to me on a booth that I was working on, and he starts going off at me about when he was coming up in the South, and I think it was in Arkansas, and there was basically no information, and he wanted information. And he used to read all my articles, and that's where he learned everything. Well, it turned out this guy is the guy that was Prince's keyboard player for about 13 years. So, and I mean, he was just going off at me, which freaked me out a little, but kind of felt good, So the manuals was a similar idea. Manuals, they are documentation. They're supposed to document. They're not really supposed to be interesting. They're just supposed to be functional. And my approach to those was there was only one really interesting thing about it. Having come at it from the point of view of being a user, not a design engineer, I would basically put it in two parts. And I still do this. The first part is functional. It's like, I want to do this. How do I do this? And it would give you the procedures for it. And the second part was reference. And that's like, okay, here's every menu selection. Here's every parameter. And we're going to tell you everything that's in it. So if you really want to get down and dirty, it's there. But most people are just interested in the first part most of the time. And then when they start getting into it, then they have questions. And then they flip to the back to the reference part and they go, oh, good, it's there. That's what this thing does. But that all of this and all of my writing career came from being a user. The whole time, what I started writing about was the kind of work I was doing and the kind of things that I was encountering and the kind of technology I was interested in using. So the entire writing career started off as a side career. It turns out, of course, it's much easier to make money writing manuals and marketing and documentation than it is making music and doing sound design.
In 1985, you started working as an audio engineer at Russian Hill Recording. Did you get to meet any famous artists while working there?
It was a great place. I had done engineering back east in Boston. And when I got out to San Francisco, Russian Hill Recording was one of the recording studios I went to looking for work. And the thing that was great about it is it was very, very low key. It was just, there was no sign in front. It was just in a neighborhood in Russian Hill. And so artists could come there and not be harassed. And they also were one of the very first studios to use multi-track audio machines to do film scores or film soundtracks. Actually, they didn't have room to do orchestra scoring, but to do film soundtracks. Before that, everybody was using MAG, which is the same thing that film is on, but instead of having film emulsion on it, it would have magnetic emulsion for recording audio. And so Russian Hill was part of the new wave that was using 24-track, multi-track tape decks. And so a lot of people who were doing scores that were musicians were more comfortable in the recording studio environment. And so I remember at one point there was a film called Walker being made, and the soundtrack was being done by Joe Strummer from The Clash. And so Joe was in and out all the time. And I had some great interactions with him. One time I was riding my bicycle to the studio, and I see Joe walking on the streets of San Francisco, walking past the projects, just by himself, about 1.5 miles, 2 miles from the studio, not right next door. And so I pulled up to him, and we already knew each other from the studio. I said, you mind if I walk with you? He goes, no. So I had about 45 minutes or an hour just to walk through San Francisco talking with Joe Strummer, which was great. But the first time I'd actually met him, my my area at the studio was they had a small synthesizer studio upstairs, Studio C. And I was working there and I smelled some pot. Well, that wasn't that unusual. And I just kind of stuck my head out and I looked around and there wasn't anybody else up on that floor at that time. I'm like, that's weird. You wouldn't usually smell it all the way from downstairs. And I went downstairs and looked around and nobody was smoking. I'm like, that's really weird. So I went back upstairs, went back in my room, and then I smelled it again even stronger. Like, what is going on? Then I realized there's a skylight in my room. So I went out of the room. There was a short flight of steps up to the roof. I opened the door, and there's Joe sitting in a folding chair right next to the skylight, sparking up. And that was like the first time I met him because I looked at him and I just laughed. And he's like, what are you laughing at? And then I explained, and he thought it was pretty funny. So there were also a lot of musicians that would get hired to come do ads and jingles, which they did a fair amount there. There were great musicians like David Grisman. And these guys, they would take breaks and they'd just be hanging out on the street. Just all these fabulous musicians, guys from the band C Train and the Blues Project, some of the late 60s, early 70s bands. And they were out there making ads and doing soundtracks. Mark Isham did his first several soundtracks there. I remember watching him mix one of his albums, and the poor guy had the flu. And so he's just kind of laying on the couch in the back of the room while the engineer was mixing. And every once in a while, he'd sit up and make himself an espresso so he could function. But Mark was also a guy that had played a lot around the Bay Area. So he was known in that area. So, yeah, there would be people that would come in and out. And the fact that it was so low key, people didn't treat them like superstars. And it was a very, very nice environment. And it was, really good engineers working there. It was a great opportunity. I learned a lot working there and had a lot of fun times.
And Mark released several albums during your time there between 1985 and 1987.
Yeah, I don't remember how many of the albums he did there. He did this one. Oh, I can't quite bring up the name right now. I actually love the album too, but I haven't listened to it in a little while. But he did several soundtracks there. That's where he first started doing soundtracks, was there. And I had friends that played in bands with him at the time because he was a Bay Area kind of guy. So, yeah, that was another. I've just been very lucky to kind of arrive at good places at good times. Same thing happened when I got to LucasArts, later on. So, but that when I was at Russian Hill, that led to some other things. I worked on the movie The Thin Blue Line, Errol Morris's movie. Mm-hmm. And that was interesting because, of course, the movie was largely dialogue. And I was the assistant dialogue editor. And so I would often be sent off to find alternate takes because there was a problem with a particular take. This is before there were any digital workstations. This was all done with synchronized tape-to-tape dubbing. And so I would be sent off, and I ended up listening a lot to the original recordings that he'd made of the interviews. And I probably got more familiar with those interviews than anybody other than Errol Morris himself, because I really had to dig into it. And it was really interesting because if you've ever seen that movie, he would do these interviews that would be like an hour and a half long, over the course of which somebody would sort of show themselves to be a fool, basically. Not everybody, but this happened a lot. And then he would have to edit that down like crazy because he only had 20 or 30 seconds to make the point. So you start to wonder, there's a lot of danger in doing that level of editing and that you're changing what somebody said. And I was one of the few people who got to hear the original and then hear the edits. And I was actually really impressed with how faithful he was to what they'd actually been saying and the way they'd been saying it, even though, the minute you weren't seeing somebody on screen, he was chopping like a cowboy. It was amazing the amount of editing that would go on the minute somebody was not actually on screen. So the guys that were the dialogue editors for that were also working at another studio on the Gumby TV series. And they called me after Thin Blue Line to come down and do music editing on the Gumby series. And so this kind of furthered my post-production experience. It was the first TV work that I did. And that was also a wild experience doing Gumby because the deadlines were insane. I was at one point, I had nothing else in my life at the time. So I was letting work dictate how many hours I worked. And I started working longer and longer days until I finally topped out at something like a 38-hour day where I'd work 24 hours and have 14 hours off. So I'd be coming to work one day at 3 in the afternoon and the next day at 11 at night and the next day at 4:30 in the morning. It was quite quite an experience. And of course, I'm doing these hours, working 24-hour shifts, working on Gumby, for crying out loud. This bizarre, surrealistic animation. So my entire world was a little bit fuzzy around the edges, you know. And I got to work with Art Clokey, who created Gumby. And that was a great experience.
And is it true that you voiced the blockheads who were silent in the original airing of the show?
I am the only voice of the blockheads in all of Gumby history. They were silent up until then, and then I overdubbed Chortles and Sniggers, and then afterwards, they never did any other vocals for them either, according to Art Clokey's son. So yes, that is my great claim to fame. I am the only voice of the blockheads in all of Gumby history.
And was this your idea?
Well, I was doing this music editing. Well, what had happened was they were doing a new series, and they had a composer doing new music, and they were doing new sound design. And when Art Clokey heard that up against the old stuff he'd done, he thought the old stuff sounded horrible, and he wanted to redo it. But they didn't have, ABC wouldn't give him any extra budget. So he had to scrape up extra money, and they gave me all this music that had been composed tightly to completely different picture. A lot of people don't realize this, but many composers, when they first write for picture, feel the need to have the music hit everything that happens on the screen. Every time an event happens, the music highlights it. The more experience the composer gets, the more they realize you need to be more selective about that. Part of it is having a flow and then picking your points where you're going to emphasize. But this composer was new to writing for picture, so he hit everything on screen, and I was supposed to take this music and make it fit entirely different picture. So this is why I had to work so many crazy hours, and at 2:30 in the morning, they'd be mixing in the next room, and they'd realize there was a minor character that was saying something or making a sound, and they had no sound for it. And they knew that I did voices. So they would come into me, and I'd be like in there with my eyes hanging down to my knees, and they'd say, "Hey, Larry, you want to come in and overdub some voices for us?" And I go, "Yeah, make me a triple espresso. I'll be right there." And they would make me a triple actual cappuccino. And I would go in there and record these voices, and that's how the blockhead stuff happened. I was actually recording some other voices, and I saw the blockheads and said, let me do some stuff for them too. So yeah, that was quite a project.
And on the Thin Blue Line, how was it editing dialogue back in the 80s?
Well, it was particularly crazy for these guys because the story takes place in Texas. So all these interviews are Texans, and Texans don't end their words. They run them into the next word. And as I said, the minute somebody was not being interviewed on screen, that you weren't seeing them, Errol Morris was editing insanely. And so he was cutting between words when there wasn't any between words. And these guys had to go find consonants and glue them on. Well, in Pro Tools, that's a piece of cake. You know, you just find the right shape of crossfade and you get the spacing right and you're all set. But this was tape to tape dubbing of using tape synchronizers, which were very temperamental beasts. And so what they would have to do is they would have to find a consonant, and then they'd have to sit there and rehearse it, 15 or 20 times to try and get the timing just right. And they would have to do a manual crossfade on the mixer to get the levels right. There was not automation. There was automation in the SSL downstairs, but not in the editing suite. So it was extremely laborious and really took, a touch of art to make it happen. And I was the assistant editor, so I was responsible for keeping all those synchronizers working, and they would just go crazy. And the dialogue editor would say, I'm going to go grab a cup of coffee. I'll be back in 10 minutes. And I'd be flat on my back, fooling around with synchronizers, trying to get them to work. So, and it was interesting because during that same time period, digital audio workstations were just beginning to happen, the earliest ones. And there was an early one called Waveframe. No. It was Diaxis. And they wanted to sell us one for doing the dialogue editing. And they came in to do a demo. And we said, fine, if our dialogue editor can edit a page of dialogue faster on your machine than doing it tape to tape, then we'll buy it. Otherwise, we won't. And they couldn't make it work. And this was right around the same time as Gumby, very, very similar time period. So at the time, it was all about these synchronized tape machines and these temperamental synchronizers. And it was really a lot of grueling work to do dialogue editing. So, boy, has it changed now.
But even now it's tedious. When I'm working on these conversations, sometimes one of the words is muffled. And unlike recording dialogue for movies or such, in which you have several takes, when you record a conversation, then you don't have several takes. So you have to, read the transcript and find that particular word in that particular tone in a different part of the conversation and then paste it together. And it's tedious nowadays. So I presume that back in the 80s, when you had to mix manually between the two takes?
Yes. You had to do manual crossfades. So, if you didn't get the timing of it right, there might be a little swell right at the crossfade, and then you have to do it again and again till you get it right. So what you're saying is true. The actual art of editing and finding the right pieces remains really difficult. But the execution of the edit, once you have your materials and know what you want to do, that's the part that's much easier now than it was then. But yeah, editing is always laborious. That's, but on the other hand, that's where the magic happens. If you make an album, a music album, recording the album is one thing, but, editing and comping the vocals together, and that's where you get these masterworks that are amazing.
When you work on a certain movie or on a composition, then how do you know that your work is done? You can always spend more time on that particular thing. You can work endless hours, but when do you tell yourself that, this is the best I could get with the deadline I currently have? How do you battle perfectionism?
Glad am I you asked that question. That's a really, really important question for anybody doing any kind of creative work. And it's a question that I've given a lot of thought to as well as a lot of work on. And I finally came up with actually a pretty good answer. I developed what I call producer's ears. And there's several aspects of producer's ears. One of them is being able to hear something that's incomplete and sort of be able to project what it's going to be like when it's done. But another of it is developing a sense of, okay, this isn't perfect. If I listen to this 3 years from now, I'm still going to hear it. I know I'm going to hear it. But is it going to bother me? Am I going to feel like that spoils it? Or am I just going to feel like, yeah, I couldn't get that better at the time, but it's okay. And I really had to hone that sense of judgment. And that was the key, was being able to get good at judging whether this is really going to bother me if I hear it again in 3 years. And if it is, you got to go back and keep working on it. But many times you look at it and you go, yeah, you know what? That'll just kind of be charming because that's the way it was at the time, because that was the reality, because it doesn't ruin the feel that I'm trying to get. And I might even be able to say it enhances it. Sometimes it does. When you have a vocalist who's singing a part and one note doesn't quite hit the pitch or their voice cracks a little bit, that conveys feeling. And that's desirable. And one of the things that lacks in a lot of modern music is everything is made too perfect. And so it lacks feeling. And one of the interesting things is in music and sound design and everything I'm doing now, I find myself gravitating more towards imperfection because it's so expressive. But then you come to another judgment call you have to develop, which is the fine line between loose and sloppy. I don't want to be sloppy, but loose conveys a lot of feeling and expression. So that also comes into this decision about, will this bother me in 3 years or will it feel expressive? So, that's kind of how you decide when you're done. Now, in commercial environments, like when I was doing Gumby, that's broadcast TV. And the thing you're working on is going to get broadcast next Sunday, no matter what you do. So that limits your choices. There are times when you just have to say, this is going to bother me in 3 years. And that's too bad. I haven't got any choice, because I have a deadline. So it all depends a lot on the context. The post-production supervisor for Gumby used to say, look, if we have to deliver a tape with nothing on it but a 2-pop, which is the traditional way of synchronizing picture and sound, we deliver it, but we deliver it on time. Whatever it takes. If there's nothing else on that darn tape, at least it gets there on time. So, sometimes you don't have a choice. When you do have a choice, for me, it's deciding how much it's going to matter down the road. And if you develop a good sense of that, then it's a lot easier to tell when you're done. When you're just picking at something, but it's done. The other thing is, listening when you get that close to the end, listening to the whole thing in entirety or watching the whole thing in its entirety, because that is the context within which you make this judgment of, will it bother me? If you look at the whole thing all the way through and you go, God, I hardly even noticed that, then it's like, okay, I think this thing's done. I could keep going, but it captures what it's supposed to capture, and it does it well. So I personally have gotten very good at that because I've thought a lot about these things. And one of the things I've thought about is everybody has projects that never get finished. But ultimately, doing the work and not completing the project it begs the point of why did you do the project and what are you actually accomplishing? At times, sure, there's material you might actually end up reusing later. There's an idea you might have developed. But by and large, completing projects is really important. And so I've sort of made it my stock and trade. I became a really good project manager while I was doing post, but really when I got to games is when this came into full flower, by saying, look, I bring projects to successful conclusions. That's what I do. I figure out how to watch the high level, the low level, whatever I have to watch, but I get it across the finish line and it's good. And, that all plays into the sense of when is it finished? If you develop, like I'm good at finishing projects, then part of that is knowing when it's finished. And it's a sense you develop. It's not entirely intuitive, partly not intuitive, but you learn how to weave those together. And that's how you know when something is done. I mean, like I said, there's always practical considerations. Sometimes there's another project that's bearing down on you. And it's like, I'm out of time. I have to finish this project and move on to the next. But what I was just discussing, what I think you were asking about, is when you have the choice, how do you make that choice? And that's what I just spoke to.
So your secret is embracing the imperfections because, I always get the sense this is going to bother me a year from now or 2 years from now. And every time I'm going to look at that thing, that's the only thing I'm going to think about. So maybe embracing.
No. It's not embracing the imperfections. It's what you're talking about. It's developing a judgment, a sense of judgment of when those imperfections are going to be okay 2 or 3 years later and when they're not. That's the key. The imperfections can carry expressiveness, but they also can be wrong. And the key is in deciding which is it when you're in the here and now, you're projecting forward to what it's going to be in the future. The embracing imperfection has more to do with the emphasis now on absolute perfection and how much stuff that's so perfect that way leaves me cold. And it's not just music. I mean, sometimes in film and things like that, everything is just, you don't feel it as much because it's just too perfect. There's no feeling there.
Yeah, I mean, people think that the problem with movies nowadays is the CGI, and they always say that practical effects are more realistic than CGI. But the problem with CGI is not that it's too realistic. It's just that it's too clean. The thing that George Lucas figured out early on with Star Wars is that you have to have a used future to make it seem like these people lived in that location for several years. Because every movie nowadays looks like they just wore this costume or just visited this location for the first time, and no one else has been here, and no one else has worn this costume. And so,
No, you're absolutely right. I think, and when I was at LucasArts, one of the things, when you're up close with that stuff every day, one of the things you notice was part of the brilliance of that world, of that universe, is you have this futuristic stuff of, hyper leaps and all that. But at the same time, you have these clunky machines, these big rusty machines that can barely turn. And having both of those in the same universe is what makes it feel real. And you're exactly right. You're also right that it's not the technology of CGI that's at fault. It's in how it's being used. It's in feeling like you have to clean everything up perfectly. And the really good CG artists, they'll often do the other way around. They'll go and they'll put a rust spot in somewhere. They'll put that rust spot there, a tiny one. And, this is something that I like to do in sound design and in music, is have things that are almost subliminal, where you feel them more than you hear them. And visual artists do the same sort of thing. And that's where you get veracity. That's where you can do something that is totally fictional from another world, and yet it feels alive and real. because it has those imperfections like we're talking about, But it's all in the judgment. It's all in deciding how to use the technology, where to introduce perfection, how much imperfection, how much is too much, all of that,
In 1994, you started working as a lead editor and operations manager at Wave Group Sound. Nowadays, Wave Group Sound is known for creating music for, games like Guitar Hero and notification sounds for Facebook Messenger and other Facebook products. But back then, their focus was on audio post-production and commercials and corporate training videos. What can you share about your time at Wave Group Sound?
Well, when I did Gumby, one of the guys who was sort of effectively the post-production supervisor, it wasn't actually his role title, but he did a lot of the work, was a guy named James Allen. And after Gumby, he formed Wave Group Sound. And a lot of the animators from Gumby, several of them in particular, went off and started a company and started a series called Bump in the Night that was on ABC TV. It was a Saturday morning series. And Wave Group Sound was formed basically to do sound for that. And James, having worked with me at Russian Hill and on Gumby, called me to basically be his second in charge. And so I went down to Wave Group Sound, and we were doing Bump in the Night. And we were bringing in a number of interns to, as unpaid wage slaves or no wage slaves, as it were. But, it was fair because the whole point was we gave them training. We didn't just say, do this. We showed them how to do it. We showed them why this is the right way, why this is the wrong way. And one of the interns that came in was a guy named Will Littlejohn. And Will had been a keyboard player, and he lived in Hawaii, and he had played in bands that were like really popular in Hawaii and done all this island hopping. And then he'd come back to the States, and for a while he'd work for his mom, who did real estate, but she worked with a lot of people, large landowners, not corporate, but like farmer types. And Will had to borrow a pickup truck and a plaid shirt to go out and deal with these people. And he just this isn't what I want to do. So he showed up at Wave Group Sound and he said, look, I'm a keyboard player. I don't know anything about audio, but I want to learn and I'm good. And so I mentored him a lot and taught him, the ropes, and he was real good. he took the ball and ran with it. And eventually he bought Wave Group Sound from James. And under him, he was under Will, he was still doing a lot of post-production, but that's when he started doing more games. That's when he got involved with Facebook. So to my knowledge, and of course I sort of fell out of touch with him around that time, so I really don't know the details up close, but to my knowledge, it was Will Littlejohn and one or two of the other interns he'd gotten to know who came with him and blossomed into their own senior level people, that took Wave Group in that direction. And I really haven't talked to him in years, and I'd love to. I mean, when I knew him, I'd take him home sometimes, let him crash on my couch overnight. We go back to work the next day, and he boy, oh boy, he became really good.
And you're credited as the sound editor on Bump in the Night. 13 episodes of Bump in the Night. What can you share about your time working on that show, on these episodes?
I was also kind of operations manager at Wave Group Sound, but the show was really fun because the two guys that were behind it, Ken Potak and Dave Blyman, were they were maniacs. They were mad people in the most wonderful way, in the best, most wonderful way. The producer was a woman named Rose Dwinian, and I had no idea at the time that she had been so instrumental at ILM. I mean, she was deep in the core of that, and I did not know that at the time. But our studio was located in the back of a warehouse where they were doing the animation. So I could walk out the door of the studio, and there were 25 stop motion animation stages that I could just walk around and hang around, talk to the animators, and find out what the episode was about and what they were doing. And it was really fun. Real stop motion animation is an amazing thing if you see it done, because every item in a picture has to be moved a fraction of an inch, and then they take one shot, and then they have to move every one a fraction of an inch. So they have to track all these objects and project what the motion is going to be like. And when we were doing Bump in the Night, computers were just starting to really come into the production process. And one of the early things that came out of that was frame buffers. So the animators were able to see the last 3 or 4 frames that they had shot as they were setting up the next one. and that really helped things. So, and meanwhile, we were there, and we were also kind of in the forefront of what was going on. We were doing multi-track work, but we didn't have a big budget, and so we were using ADATs. And the ADAT had come out relatively recently, and we were one of the early adopters for post-production of ADATs. Not that many people were using it for post-production. And the thing about post-production is when you're doing audio post, your source material is moving around all the time. You're looping playback or you're jumping here and moving there. It's constant. It's very different than recording music or something like that. And the ADATs were not necessarily so good at always following each other when you had three of them syncing up. They were amazing for what they cost, but they were not designed for that kind of hardcore level. So every 6 or 8 weeks, Elises, who made the ADAT, would end up flying an engineer up to us because we were having some bizarre problem. And he would come in there and he'd poke at him and he'd go, wow, never seen him do this before. And he'd poke around and he'd finally figure out what it was. And he'd say, thanks, we'll make a change in the firmware and go away. And a couple months later, he'd come back. I made a few good friends at Elises that way. So, it was a very fun experience. It was, post-production is always kind of harrowing. But the kind of fun that we would have is, for example, Ken Pontac came by. There was a character named Squishington, and Squishington lived in the toilet. And the deal with ABC was that he could not, there were two things ABC said. He cannot live in the bowl, and he cannot be brown. And so they made him Tidy Bowl Blue, and he lived in the tank. And so he would make all these squishy sounds when he moved. And so Ken Pontac sat down with me one day and we went through our entire sound library and he picked out the fart sounds that were the approved fart sounds. We had an approved fart library. And that's what we used in doing sound. So doing sound for that series was like that. There was just an element of wackiness that was desirable. And that's rare. You don't get that opportunity very much, that you can do something that's just really stupid, but if it makes the guy laugh, he loves it. And so, I had a chance to do all kinds of, crazy, ridiculous things or auditory puns or, jokes and things like that, which is great for your creative development as well. But it's just a very rare opportunity. You get it more in games. That kind of creativity is often there, not necessarily in first-person shooters, but in a lot of other kinds of games where you're kind of encouraged to go off the rails a little bit. At LucasArts, that definitely happened. But that's a lot of what Bump in the Night was like. And I actually have, you can't see it from this angle, but I have some puppets from Bump in the Night. I have a couple of Bumpies and a Squishy behind me right back there. And I even have, I can show you this. Hang on a second.
Oh, wow. This is exciting.
I'm leaving the picture, but this is very, very rare. This is what was inside of a Bumpy puppet. They would have this armature inside. Mm-hmm. And that's how the animators would animate, is by moving the armature. And sometimes the armatures would come loose. And so that's why they're showing where the junction points were, that they would have to tighten up if it came loose. So, just being around all of this gave me a completely different view of doing sound for it, being immersed in the low-level detail. And, hanging around with the animators. At that time, the Wallace and Gromit stuff was happening. And I'm spending all my time with stop-motion animators, and I'm getting their viewpoint on this. So they're making technical observations and showing, why it was particularly amazing, and talking about their own styles of animation. And, and all of this you're soaking in all of this. So as you're doing sound, you're immersed in all of this animation stuff. And that, there are even times now when I get kind of a visual feeling when I'm doing something and I'm trying to portray something only with sound without picture. And sometimes the way I do it is I get an almost visual sense, an almost like animation sense of, if it was visual, what would it look like? So what should it sound like, in order to convey that? So yeah.
At what stage in the production process did you guys join in? Because I presume that you waited for them to complete the stop motion animation, then start working on it. But did you guys start working on the sound while they were working on the animation? How did you manage things like lip syncing and matching the audio to what's happening on screen?
For cartoon animation, typically where it starts is recording the dialogue. That's the first thing. because the animators animate to the dialogue, not the other way around. But again, like Gumby, this was a weekly broadcast TV show. So there were 25 stages because those guys had to crank out animation and we had to be cranking out sound right behind them. They would crank it out. We would get video of what had been shot in a rough edit a day or two later, maybe a few days, depending on the editing. And we would start cutting sound to it. And then they'd give us a final edit and we'd have to revise what we had done to make it match the final edit. But it was all very, very fast. In fact, one of the interesting things was partly aesthetically and partly pragmatically, the animation style of the show was very fast motion. If you look at some of the stop motion animation movies like James and the Giant Peach or Nightmare Before Christmas, which a lot of these same animators worked on. They worked on both of those movies. They're very smooth flowing motion. Well, they had a few years to do that. These guys had to crank out 25 minutes of animation per person per week, and that's a lot when you're shooting one shot at a time. And so there was this style where all the motion would be very fast like this because they would use less frames for emotion. So everything was very fast-paced on the show. The way they animated was fast-paced. The way we had to cut sound was fast-paced. It was all very, very fast. And we were talking before about how you decide if something's going to bother you 2 or 3 years down the road. You really didn't get that opportunity in this environment. In this environment, you just had to get it as close as you could to right. And if you're working on it that much, that hard, that fast, you get pretty good. You might screw it up once in a while, but most of the time you get it right, So the lip sync would be done before we even got it. They would do they would animate to it, and then we'd get the sound in the picture, but matching them up was easy because it had been animated to the voice recordings. The music was a little bit tougher. I mean, that would be composed to picture, but it didn't always line up precisely because they might have changed the animation a little bit since the composer did the composing. So there was always a bit of fudging things, but mostly it was a matter of fitting things together, and the sound design was the biggest thing where you had to kind of go from nothing and work it out. But hey, we had an approved fart library, so we were okay.
How many fart sound effects did you guys have? How many approved fart sound effects did you guys have?
About 3 dozen, a little more, something like that. Okay. It actually wasn't that large a body, but you can always process it. By this time, we had the ADATs, but we were also starting to get more Pro Tools. So we were not doing synchronized tape decks like we had done on Gumby. And so in Pro Tools, you could do more in the way of, it was still early for plugins, but there were some plugins, and there was processing you could do, to take the same farts and repurpose them. You could edit them together. You could stack them, There was plenty of fart surgery to be done. I suppose you could call it fart time work.
Fart work instead of hard work.
We were fart workers.
Moving on to 1995, when did you start working at LucasArts? Well,
that is a segue, because what happened was I had known Michael Land and Peter McConnell from their Lexicon days. I was still sort of associated with Lexicon, even though I wasn't working there. And every once in a while, I'd do some consulting for them or whatever. And so I'd gotten to know Mike and Pete through my contact with Lexicon. Mike had gone on to LucasArts some years before. He had gotten Peter to join him. Clint was an old high school friend of Michael's who had graduated from New England Conservatory. And so Michael had brought him on as a composer. And I had met Clint because a guy named Tom Cottle, who was in LucasArts' IT department, had brought Clint to a gig that a band I was in was playing in Fairfax, California. And that's how I first met Clint. And so I got a phone call. I don't remember whether it was from Mike, Pete, or Clint. And they were like, wow, we want to come check out what you're doing in this Bump in the Night. It really sounds fun. Because I think I'd written an article or something about it. And they came down. And what I did not realize is they were scoping me out, because they had realized that there was more and more digital audio coming into games at that point. It was very limited. You could have like maybe one stream and a few samples you could play, but it was clear the direction it was going. And so they had the vision to realize it was heading in the same direction as like film post. And none of them had any experience with audio post, but they knew me and they knew I was doing audio post. And so they had decided that they needed somebody on board who knew audio post. And like I said, they already knew me. So they came down to Wave Group Sound. This is in Brisbane, California, in a big warehouse down there. And I showed them around the whole place. And I showed them how we operated. And I showed them all the databases I designed and all this and that and, the systems, et cetera, et cetera. And like I say, I had no idea that they were checking me out. But of course, in games, systems are absolutely critical, managing assets and things like that. And so flash forward a few months, I was at the NAMM show again, because I basically go every year. And my brother was the editor of Electronic Musician magazine. And he was famous for having these parties in his hotel room. And at that time, cannabis was on the down low. It was not legal. And so his parties, which were known as the Wolf Howl, is where all the stoners in the industry would basically come to hang out. And so I was there, and Clint shows up at this party. And he starts talking to me and telling me how they're building a new facility, and he's drawing on the back of a napkin how it's going to be laid out. And he's talking about the directions that things are going, and they're going to be doing this, and they need more experience in that. And I said, oh, well, this is something that I already do. And that's something I've always been interested in. And this looks like a really exciting direction. And he looks at me, he goes, that occurred to us. And that was when I suddenly realized I was being recruited in that moment. I kind of freaked out. I'd never actually been recruited in that way before. And so I still remember at the party when he left, I took that napkin that he'd sketched the future studio on, and I folded it up so nobody else would find it. And the next day, instead of going to the show, I spent the time at a hotel restaurant with Mike and Pete and Clint. And we just talked about the whole thing. And that's how I ended up going over there. And when I first went there, I had no experience in interactive at all. I had plenty of experience in linear production, but not interactive. But I didn't even get to start there because they were building a new facility and they were trying to do games at the same time. And they needed somebody to oversee this new facility. And they also realized that they had to start having shared assets online that the whole sound department could access. And at the time, networking was really in its infancy. And there was not like a network. You couldn't stream across a network easily. So they said, we need somebody to figure this out for us. We need somebody to oversee the construction of this new facility. And that's how you're going to start. And I'm like, sure, great. So I oversaw the construction of the new LucasArts sound facility, which was an experience in and of itself. I started off by showing up the first day to the construction supervisor with a case of beer. And I said, here, this is for you and your guys. And he said, yeah, well, we can't drink when we're on duty. And I'm like, okay, then at the end of the day. And he's like, yeah, you're all right, And so I oversaw that whole thing. And I also researched networks and found a network switch that we could have locally for the sound department, which the IT department didn't really like. But Mike Land, he was a great manager, especially in that he was an advocate for his department and for his people. And so he went in and he said, look, either you support us or we support ourselves, one or the other. If you expect us to get the job done, that's how it's going to be. So either you're going to give us the network switch and the bandwidth we need, or we're going to get our own. And they went, okay, well, you can get your own. Obviously, that didn't last that long before they finally said, all right, we'll support you. But it lasted a couple of years. So I did a bunch of research. We got a network switch. We set up a little network just for the sound department. And I later on wrote an entire sound library because there was no off-the-shelf sound libraries that was able to stream across that network. So I started working, doing those two things before I ever got to do any interactive work. And then the first interactive job I got, they're like, okay, you know what you're doing with post-production. You don't know interactive. I'm like, yeah, well, how hard could it be? How different could it be? And they're like, yeah, okay. I'll tell you what, you're going to work on Rebel Assault 2. Because Vince Lee is the project lead, and Vince basically does everything himself. He writes the video engine, he writes the sound engine, all that stuff he does himself. And he'll be a great guy for you to work with because he can pick up a lot of the slack. And that's exactly how it worked. Vince was freaking genius. I mean, the guy was just really, really, really good. And it was a great first project for me because for exactly the reasons they said. I had to learn the most basic things about interactive. And it really opened my mind up. I mean, it was such a different conception. And the thing that was nice is, when I got to LucasArts, I was like the old guy. The average age at LucasArts was like 27. I was 40 when I arrived. I already had all this post-production experience behind me. When you get to that point in your career, it's not as common to have something that just explodes your mind, that totally sets you in a completely different direction, completely different conception and way of thinking about your work and what you do. And that's what learning interactive did for me. And it was wonderful. It rejuvenated me. It just really gave me direction that I still work from, even when I'm not working on interactive stuff. All those lessons of interactive still come into play. I'm very much one who likes to repurpose, knowledge and work in many ways. So that was just an incredible experience coming into that. And then shortly, a few months after I arrived there, we moved into the new building. And that was pretty interesting too. Shortly before we did, when I first started, LucasArts was at was it A building, I think, which was ILM, and it was down at what was called Kerner. It was a complex of buildings in San Rafael that said nothing about LucasArts. There was never any Lucas sign of any kind, because if there had been, they would have had to have crowbars to pry the Star Wars freaks off the walls. So it just said Kerner Optical Company is what Sprocket Systems that became Skywalker Sound said, and we were in ILM buildings, and then we moved up to this new facility that had been built in an old insurance building or something like that, and that was just an incredible change because we didn't really have any sound facility down at Kerner, and now suddenly we had a studio. And, a control room and a studio and sound isolated suites that people could work in. And it was quite a difference. Unfortunately, by the time I came along, they had the design of the whole suite already done. And it was just overseeing the construction. I probably would have made some changes to the design of the suite, but, they were trying to make games at the same time as trying to design a new facility. So that's how that went. I don't know. That's a very, very long answer to a short question.
So your meeting with Clint at that party was the official LucasArts interview, or did you get to have one in the LucasArts offices as well?
Yes, I did. The way it was that Clint approached me. That's what the party was. Yeah. The next day I had this big meeting where they basically got a better feel for, is this guy the right guy? Is it going to work out? Then, yes, I came up, and LucasArts, especially at that time, had a pretty brutal regime, about 7 hours of interviews you would do. You would interview with directors. You would interview with department heads. Obviously I talked with Mike and Pete and Clint and all that. There was a fourth guy who does not get mentioned very often, Mike McMahon. Mike McMahon was a sound programmer. He was a nuts and bolts sound programmer. Mike and Pete were both great programmers, but they had a lot of other responsibilities. And as far as programming goes, their orientation had by necessity turned more towards being architects than doing all of the nuts and bolts. Now, Mike McMahon was an amazing nuts and bolts guy who could write sound engines, but he was kind of a quiet guy. And he loved that the rest of us were maniacs. He loved that Mike and Pete and Clint and I were maniacs. And he was just kind of the quiet guy that stood off to the side and chuckled, But he was a brilliant programmer and a really nice guy. So he totally fit in. And he does not get mentioned often enough in these things. Mike McMahon was definitely there and definitely part of it, but he doesn't get interviewed by Daniel Albu. And, I want to give him
because I did approach him.
Oh, good. Good
earlier
for you.
Today.
Excellent. Good man. Yeah, no, I just wanted to give a shout out to him because I don't think he ever got as much recognition as he should. But in any event, that's. Now I forgot what your original question was. I babble, right?
I asked about the interview process because I wanted
the
to know.
The interview process. Yeah, well, I pretty much told you about that. It was like 7 hours of interviews, and there you were. It was very strange when I started because, like, my first week, I got this horrible nerve inflammation up my arm, like really debilitating. So much so I couldn't even sit in a chair. So I was on the phone lying flat on my back in the office. And then an all hands company meeting was called. And because I could barely sit, I propped myself up against a sofa right up at the front. And then this guy steps over my legs and I look up and it's George. And that's the first time I'd seen George Lucas in person. And he was telling us that there was going to be a change of president. We were going to get a new president. And he's like 4 feet in front of me. And I'm like, okay, I guess I really work for the guy, you know? So the whole experience for me had been just like getting dropped into a dream in a way, and then having my head blown up by interactive. And yeah, it was very exciting.
Well, that's a great first impression, you being on the floor while meeting George.
He looked down at me a couple times. I think he was wondering why I'm sitting there with my legs almost tripping him. But I think he was used to LucasArts being his goofier company.
So like you said, in 1995, you were credited as the sound designer on Rebel Assault 2. Now, given that this is an FMV game, and it was advertised at the time as the first live-action Star Wars footage filmed since Return of the Jedi, what was your approach to the sound design in this project?
Well, again, first of all, I was trying to learn about interactive. So there were all sorts of things that you learn, especially at the time, like there's a lot of explosions, right? Well, near the end of my time at LucasArts, when I was working on Bounty Hunter, and we were using Skywalker sound, and I asked them to make me a few dozen explosions, and they delivered these beautiful explosions with long tails and went out in 9 seconds and all this. And I went to them, I said, these sound great. Make them all 1.25 seconds. And they're like, what? How do I make an explosion that's only 1.25 seconds? And I'm like, that's all you get? Sorry, I can't give you more. So Rebel Assault was sort of like that for me. It was my first time encountering this limitation of length, this idea of having to format a bank of sounds that would get loaded and then figure out a scheme for how they would get swapped out as needed. And the sounds themselves, a great many of them were straight out of Skywalker's vaults. They were, pure Star Wars sounds. Now, over time, we actually would enhance some of those. And because for games, it just needs to be a little bit different than in the movie. In the movie, it's just different. But at the time, for that first project in particular, a lot of the stuff just came straight out of the vault. And then when there wasn't stuff that came straight out of the vault, I drew on all of my post-production experience doing sound for film, for footsteps, etc. I was the first person to bring LucasArts, and I think one of the early people in games, to actually perform Foley, to do performed Foley and not just take things out of libraries. I don't think I did Foley on Rebel Assault, but that's when it came home to me. We were going to need to do that in the future. So, a lot of it came from vaults. Some of it came from libraries. I hate just taking things from libraries and dropping them in as is. I almost never do that. So I would take things out of libraries and I would just muck around with them. And at the time, there was some creative software just starting to really come out that would allow you to warp and twist and screw things up. And, you could do a pitch envelope. So you could take a sound and give it a completely different pitch contour, which made everything, sound completely not like the original sound when all you've done is change the scope of how the pitch moves. So, but really, I wasn't that adventurous sonically on that because I was just trying to find my feet, So I did what I could because I was trying to figure out how my chop's going to fit in with this. But mostly I was like, how the heck am I going to get this thing done and deliver it and make Vince happy? And Vince was just so great. He was really understanding. A couple times he had to sit me down and kind of school me, but he was nice about it. He wasn't nasty about it. He's like, that's not going to work because of this and this. At the same time, the idea of synchronization in game engines was really new then. And his engine, as brilliant as it was not 100% reliable in terms of synchronizing sound and picture. And so I could sit there and I could drop a sound in, and the next time I played it, it wouldn't be in sync. And so that was a whole issue where Clint helped me out, because Clint had the perspective to go, no, you can't work this way. And we went to Vince and we said, Vince, we have this problem. Look at this. And now you see it, now you don't. Or now you hear it, now you don't. And Vince would go in and find the bug that was causing the problem and fix it. But that's where I was at on Rebel Assault much more than really being creative. I was just kind of trying to get my toe into the water and figure it out.
Now, in 1996, you were credited once again as sound designer on the PlayStation version of Rebel Assault 2. And this version featured several improvements over the PC version released the previous year. Did you need to do any additional work for this version?
Well, sure, because PlayStation and the consoles relied much more on banks of sounds, even more than the PC did. And trying to remember if the first PlayStation could even stream. I can't even remember if it did. You might know that. But, you had to repurpose the same assets, but repurposing was a fair amount of work. Not a tremendous amount. It wasn't like doing a game from scratch, but it wasn't easy as pie. It took some calculation, some figuring, and a lot of. I got to be really good friends with the testers. It's kind of funny. The testers at LucasArts, some people kind of look down on them, and I could never figure that out. To me, they were the most critical asset because I was never a very good player. And even when I was trying, if I was trying, I couldn't pay enough attention to what I was supposed to be listening to. So what I would do is I would just go down to test and I'd say, is there somebody who can play this level of this game and I can just sit behind him and listen? And they go, yeah, sure. And the testers just loved it that I valued their work. So I got to be really close with the testers. And when I had to do something like converting to PlayStation and I had to check out whether or not the new bank that I made worked in practice, that's how I would do it. I'd go down to test. I'd say, do you have a build with this new bank? Well, let me show you. Yeah, we do. Can I watch somebody play it? Yeah, sure. Go over there. Andy's there. And of course, all those guys like Andy Alamano and, they're all senior level game guys for years now. And at the time they were all, tester kids. So it was fun. I learned a lot by going down to test, especially because they were not shy. They'd pipe up and they'd say, this doesn't sound right. This should be more crunchy. Don't you think? And they knew I was the sound designer. They had respect for it, but they were unafraid to express their opinions. And I was unafraid to take their opinions. It's like, these are the guys that love to play. They live to play. And if they think it should sound more crunchy, I'm going to use my judgment, but I'm sure going to think long and hard about whether or not I can add some crunch, So when I would do something like the PlayStation thing, I would rely on the testers a lot to check my work, but it wasn't like doing a game from scratch.
Well, the playtesters are the most important part of any project. Yesterday we played Zach McCracken and the Alien Mindbenders. I played with David Fox and Matthew Allen Kane, and we just found a 36-year-old bug in the original game. So now I have to talk to the playtesters to see how they missed it.
Well, it's not that they missed it. It's not necessarily that they missed it. It's what we were talking about before about having deadlines. And the way it worked in games was you would have, at least at LucasArts, 3 levels of bugs. A bugs, B bugs, and C bugs. A bugs were showstoppers. That was just like the game dies, that's it. B bugs were serious bugs. They didn't stop you from playing, but maybe you could get outside the world or something like that was bad, but not deadly. C bugs were like, that's not really quite the way we want it to work, but yeah, it works. And basically, in reality, when all the A bugs were crushed, they took it away from you and shipped it because they had to. I mean, the economics at that time were very different than now. At that time, everything was being sold off shelves. It was not online. So 70% of most game developers' revenues, 70% came from Christmas. And the way it worked for the retailers was shelf space is money. And so you'd get an order from, Walmart or whoever the retailer was, and they'd say, if you deliver this game you're telling us about by November 5th, we'll take X 10,000 pieces of it. But if you deliver it on November 6th, we lose $250,000 in that one day. So we're only going to take a fraction of that same number of pieces. And the problem with that is, for the game developer, it's like, you have to deliver by November 5th. You have to deliver by November 5th. And for us, it's like, dude, it's software. You can't guarantee that it will be done by any certain date. There are better and worse ways to go about developing that will get you closer, but we can't guarantee anything. And so it got to the point where it's like, are the A bugs crushed? Yes, we're shipping. But these B bugs, they're really big. They're almost A bugs. Sorry. So it's not that those testers missed that bug. It's more likely that they knew that bug and that it just got taken, the programmers weren't able to get to it in time.
Well, it was an A bug.
Well, don't know what to tell you about that.
This Sunday, I premiere my conversation with Julian Kwasniewski, and one of the things... And one of the things I talked to him about is the fact that he'd go to the testers as well and ask them to listen to a certain sound in the context of the game to see if it's repetitive in a way. And, basically when you're working on a game as the sound engineer, the sound editor, you listen to a certain sound so many times that you don't know if it annoys you because you listen to it so many times or because it's annoying in the context of the game. So he'd always play these sounds or give a sample of that part of the game to the playtesters for them to give him their opinion of that particular sound or that particular scene.
Yeah, I love Julian. We were very tight when we were there. When I first got there, he was working in the voice department. And then he came over into the sound department and he just worked his way up. And at the time, there was very little in the way of batch processing software. And when you work on games, the number of file assets you have is huge. It's in the thousands, sometimes tens of thousands. And so you cannot deal with these assets on a one-by-one basis. You've got to find some way to batch it. And I introduced Julian to a utility called Quick Keys. There was a macro utility, a pretty sophisticated macro utility for the Mac. And Julian took that ball and ran it, and he used it with Pro Tools. And he created unbelievably sophisticated automation in Pro Tools using Quick Keys. Things Pro Tools was never intended to do, where, he would automate processing of a file, and then he would move it to another track and then the next one. And he'd go through the entire track where he lined up all the files that needed to be processed because there weren't batch processors. So that was the only way he could do it. And I mean, I'd been using Quick Keys for years and I was pretty good wizard at it. And he just blew me away with some of the stuff he came up with. And he would just leave it running for like 3 hours and then he'd come back and everything would be done. A lot of things were very slow in those days, but if you figured out the automation, you could go do something else useful in the meantime.
Yeah, he told me about the voice recordings for The Dig, in which there was a problem with Robert Patrick's S's in the...
That's easy for you to say.
Yeah, in the audio. And so he had to run a de-esser on all of the sound files.
Well, that's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. As soon as batch processors came in, we just immediately went for those, and we got pretty wizard-like with those also. But that's the kind of thing he would do in Pro Tools with Quick Keys, is exactly that sort of processing. I don't know if he did that batch that way, but that's the sort of thing that he really kind of pioneered that in automating Pro Tools that way. It was quite something.
Still in 1996, you're credited as sound designer on Star Wars Shadows of the Empire. What can you share about the production of this game?
Well, especially at the time, you did not have a really expanded Star Wars universe. Now, obviously, there's millions of series and movies and all this, but at the time it was being kept very tight. So Shadows was kind of referred to as the movie without a movie, because there was a book and there was a soundtrack and there was a game, but there was no movie. So that was, was that first developed for Nintendo, I think?
Yeah, for the N64.
N64. Yeah. So those console games, as I've already discussed, were really a trick because they had very, very limited resources. And a lot of the work of making a game for them was managing those resources. I mean, that was actually as significant a part of the job as creating the actual assets, was figuring out how to implement them and what kind of tricks you could play to get around limitations and how something that really should be streamed could be loaded. And, okay, well, we'll load a piece and then we'll load another piece. We'll do a quick crossfade between them. And that way we don't have to stream them. So, Shadows was a lot of that. There were great programmers on Shadows. That really helped a lot. It was a fun project. Also in that, because it was not part of the actual Star Wars film canon, that gave us a little more freedom. And, people at LucasArts, we took the whole Star Wars thing very seriously, both because we loved the oeuvre, but also because if we got anything wrong, we were going to hear about it. If Darth Vader's X-Wing, Darth Vader's, from the players. No, George was like, he had other things on his mind. No, but if we had a TIE fighter for Darth Vader that didn't sound like Darth Vader's TIE fighter, then we would hear about it because his TIE fighter sounded different than all the rest. And that was deliberate. That was, Ben Burtt did that. He made Darth Vader's ship sound different than all the rest. And so we couldn't get away with anything. It wasn't even just Star Wars. Before I came to the company, there was Secrets of the Luftwaffe, I think. Mm-hmm. And that was a flying game. And they got a complaint from a player who had actually been in World War II and flown one of those planes. And he was complaining that something didn't sound right or didn't look right. And everybody's like, oh, man, we never thought we were going to get called out on that, by somebody who actually knows. So, the Star Wars people were great, but they were also merciless. And so we had to be very, very serious about getting those sorts of details right. And in Shadows, we had a little more freedom on that. Not a lot, because we wanted to be true to the universe, but we had a little because it wasn't part of the actual films. So, that was kind of fun. But my memory of that is really dominated by the amount of work that went into trying to make it work on the platform. Because you're just really, LucasArts really did want to try and take everything up a level. And that sometimes came back and bit us in the butt because we were really ambitious. And at that time, there were not off-the-shelf engines. I mean, yes, you have a console, but even on the console, you're running your own software. So for every game, just about, you were writing a new engine. Sometimes you'd use an engine for 3 or 4 games, but it'd get significantly modified between each one. So it wasn't like you get WIs and there you are. It's like every single time you're dealing with a new and different engine. And so the effort of dealing with that engine and trying to figure out how to make it do things that it really isn't quite capable of was as significant. Those strategies for implementation were as significant as the aspect of actually creating content. So, that's kind of, I still have the book, Shadows of the Empire, sitting on my shelf.
Wow. Can you show it to me?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I should be able to lay hands on it.
Wow. In mint condition.
It is in mint condition, yeah. I never read it all the way through. I opened it up and read bits of it. Luke saw Wedge reach for his blaster. He yelled, no! Too late. Yeah.
Actually, you should launch a Kickstarter. Larry the O reads Shadows of the Empire.
I do VO work, so that's actually not such a bad idea.
Yeah. Sell it as an audiobook.
I would do exactly that. I mean, I work with audiobooks and podcasts, so like I say, I have my own storytelling series. So yeah, that was a fun project. And another thing that was fun, a lot of the console projects were kind of more manageable. They weren't as sprawling as some of the PC games and things like that. So you had a lot of work you had to do on this strategy. There was less work on content. You just couldn't put as much in it. But overall, the entire project was a little more contained. I love working on big projects. I do a lot of working on big, sprawling projects. And like I said, my stock and trade is bringing them successful conclusions. But it's nice sometimes to have a project that has a little more constrained scope. It's just not as much strain on you. You know what I mean? You get it done and without complete and total burnout. And you go, cool, I got something good done and I didn't have to fry myself to the bone,
Still in 1996, you're credited for sound effects editing on the Macintosh version of Indiana Jones and his Desktop Adventures. Now, interestingly, Clint Bajakian was credited for the same role on the Windows version. What specific changes did you make to the Macintosh version to earn this credit?
Honestly, if I'm being really honest, I'm not sure I really earned the credit. I mean, I didn't really work on the game. They had some extra work that needed to be done. I think it was over a couple of weekends or something, and they just asked me to do it. But I don't consider myself as having been a real serious contributor to that project. Clint, I think, was. I think he contributed much more than I did. So it was very nice of them to give me that credit. I'm not sure I fully deserved it.
You got it only on the Macintosh version. So maybe you did something there.
Yeah, but not a lot. I really didn't. I mean, I helped them out. And I did generate some assets when they needed it. Because like I say, you're under the gun and you really have to deliver. And if the guy that usually does it isn't around because he just worked an 80-hour week and he's asleep, and you need these assets, then you go to whoever's there and say, please, can you help out? And, one of the things that was nice about LucasArts that was very different when I went to Electronic Arts was the sound department worked as a department. There was some amount of flow and flex. So if somebody's project was in trouble and really needed help, Mike Land would pull a couple of people off of another project that wasn't quite so far along and say, okay, go spend 2-3 weeks and get this guy out of trouble, help him out. And suddenly you'd have, the cavalry would come in and you'd have like 3 extra people to work on your project. And all of a sudden there's content flying and you're like, wow, it's all here. And your project lead is happy. And then they go back to their other projects. And that was, I thought, a very effective way to manage the department. So it was kind of under that rubric that I ended up working on the Macintosh version of that game. I did generate some assets, but I really don't consider myself a strong contributor to that project.
And
I think Clint gets much more credit.
Did you work directly with Hal Barwood?
Oh yeah, Hal he was a delight. He was a man of imagination, to be sure. And then, of course, he also had all the stories. I mean, he'd worked with George and he worked with all this he worked on films and this and that. So you'd go in there to ask him about an asset you're trying to create and he would answer your question and then give you like 10 minutes of stories. So yeah, Hal was really great. And, he was just one of those guys that you work with that has a presence. It's like, he's been there. This is when I was at Bump in the Night, I did not realize that Rose was one of those people too. And then later on, when I found out, I was like, what a missed opportunity. The conversations I could have had with her. But with Hal, you just, and he does not have a superstar-like personality. He's not a guy that thinks well of himself in that sense. He's not unaware of his own quality, but he doesn't come on like, oh, I'm so great. He just is, There were a lot of people at LucasArts like that. They weren't at all full of themselves. They were aware of how good they were, but they weren't full of themselves. Tim Schafer was another one of those. Tim was a delight. He knew he was good, but he never made you feel like you weren't as good as him. It was like the other way around. He's like, you're part of the team. Let's do something fun. So, Hal was like that too. Very, very welcoming. And, but also Hal in particular was very, very steeped in story, in how story plays. And the thing that he was finding interesting about games was similar to what I had found interesting, which is just that it was a whole new world into which he could pour his experience and imagination. And so he was enjoying, okay, I know all about story, but story happens differently in this medium. So now I have to think about story and what I know works in story and figure out how that gets implemented in this medium when I have a whole tree of different ways people can go. And, and I only got a few glimpses of watching his mind work that way, but it was interesting because he was such a master of understanding how story works. He had like a film director's consciousness and he was like aiming that at games. So that was the interesting part for me of the relatively small amount of work I did with Hal. I never really worked with him on a game all the way through, but I did work with him on several projects.
In 1997, you were credited for sound and audio, cutscene audio design, and specialized dialogue editing on Jedi Knight. It sounds like, pun intended, you managed all of the aspects of sound for this game. What do you recall about the game's production?
Well, probably the most significant thing about those cutscenes was they were some of, if not the very first game cutscenes done in surround. We had been approached by Dolby when they were starting to work on Dolby Pro Logic 2. And remember, Pro Logic 1 was surround with a single surround channel. Pro Logic 2 had 2 surround channels. And there was a guy there by the name of Jack Buser, who I'm sure you know. And at the time, he was just a junior guy. And he was trying to tell his boss, we got to get into games. We got to get this into games. They'll love this in games. You got to get this in games. And so they had come to us and they'd had a meeting. And the meeting was kind of funny because they started trying to present to us. And they got about 6 minutes in talking about what was involved in doing this. And I said, yeah, that's great. We'd love to do that. Where are the tools? And Jack turns to his boss and says, see, I told you that's what they were going to say. We just give them the tools and they're going to love it. And so I ended up, I think I borrowed some speakers from Meyer Sound, set up my suite, in quad, because it wasn't 5.1, it was quad. And those were the first surround mixes that I ever did was those cutscenes. But they were fun cutscenes to do. I mean, cutscenes are like little films. And that was something I was very familiar with. So for me, that was maybe even easier than it would have been for some of the others at the time, just because I'd done lots of film and TV and I really knew how to put it together, how to organize the tracks, how to spot it, all the mechanical aspects of it. And so that meant that I could focus more on the creative because I really had the mechanical in mind. One of the other things that I'd really developed doing post-production was skill with databases. I'd gotten really good at designing databases. When I first arrived at LucasArts, nobody was using databases. They were actually just starting to get serious about using Excel spreadsheets. And Excel spreadsheets are great, but you get to a certain point if you have sophisticated tasks or extreme amounts of data to manage when an Excel spreadsheet just isn't adequate. And so I had really kind of, especially in the sound department, but it ended up spreading through the company. I don't know about because of me, but I introduced a FileMaker Pro. And we started doing a lot of FileMaker Pro databases to track all the files, all the tasks that we needed to do, et cetera. And I got really good at programming FileMaker. And that's what I ended up developing the sound library in. But as far as Jedi Knight, having the experience working with databases, having the experience in post-production, it was very smooth and natural, almost easy to do the mechanical side of managing the assets and the tasks. And so that allowed me to just try and make really cool voice processing and, to have more fun, really, is what it comes down to. And I'll go off on a very short tangent here because this is sort of a major epiphany that I've had over the years. And that is the way to have the most fun working on a creative project is to deal with the stuff that's the least fun. Because what happens is, if you don't deal with the basic infrastructure and organization, then when you're trying to be creative, it comes back and bites you. And you have to stop what you're doing and go deal with it. If you haven't made sure that your system works smoothly, it's going to fail somewhere along the line. You're going to have to stop what you're doing, figure out what failed. And by the time you figure it out, your creative juices are gone. You got to come back the next day. So the thing you want to do is, at the beginning of your project, you just want to hold your nose and dive into all the unfun, unsexy crap of organizing. Just take the shovel and shovel the poop and just do it, And if you do that, you set yourself up to have more fun down the line. Because even if the organizational system you set up proves not to be adequate to the task, you can pivot much more easily if you're pivoting from an established organizational framework than if you have nothing. It doesn't stop you dead. And so this is why I'm talking a lot about this relative to Jedi Knight, is because I was already familiar with this whole idea. I put those organizational systems in place first. And this was not uncommon, actually, in the sound department at LucasArts. Everybody spent 3 weeks getting themselves set up before they actually started working. But once you do all that work and you get it all set up and you put it in place, then you can rock. Then you can have some fun. Then you can get in and do crazy things. And at the same time, you don't have to worry about, am I forgetting this or that? Because you've already organized it all. You can always go back and say, I've been working on this cool thing for 3 days. What am I forgetting that it has to be delivered tomorrow? And you can just go look at it and go, oh, right, that. And then you can go get it done and everything's happy. So yeah, if you want to have more fun, deal with the less fun part right out of the gate. And then you will have more fun later on. That's actually, I found that to be tremendously important.
Still in 1997, you are credited for sound on Star Wars X-Wing versus TIE Fighter. What can you share about the production of this game?
Well, X-Wing versus TIE Fighter, there was one that preceded that, I think. Another similar one. I'm trying to remember what it was. But, that was a lot of, from a sound standpoint, taking stuff we'd already done, repurposing it and trying to freshen it up, rather than, there wasn't a lot of new things to create for that. It was, mostly a matter of, you don't want all the same exact pass-bys, so you try and freshen up the pass-bys by mixing some pass-bys or mixing another element in or processing it somehow. But it was a fun game, but from a sound standpoint, it was not the most innovative thing that we did. I mean, we tried to do everything with quality, We didn't just like you sleepwalk through it or anything, but it wasn't as groundbreaking as some of the other stuff we did. It wasn't, mixing cutscenes and surround. That was interesting and different. X-Wing versus TIE Fighter was fun, and I had a good time with it. And by that point, you start to really know all the sounds of the Star Wars universe. And there's a certain thing about that that's really fun when you can just hear stuff and know exactly what it is. There's a funny thing when working at that company where you love Star Wars, and you're a little tired of starting to work with it, and then you're really getting kind of sick of it, and then you can't stand it anymore. And then it kind of starts to seem fresh again. And then you're having fun again. It was like this big cycle that happened where you get sick of it, but then it came back alive again. And, the X-Wing versus TIE Fighter period was one where I was starting to really get to know the genre, but I was kind of interested in doing more different things than were happening in that particular game. So I thought it was a good game, but for me personally, doing sound, it wasn't the most, incredible, exciting experience. It wasn't bad. I still have the mug.
Also in 1997, alongside your work at LucasArts, you started working as an editor at Electronic Musician magazine. How'd you land that gig?
Well, I had told you before how I started writing, and I was actually a contributing editor. So I wasn't actually on staff. I was on the masthead, but not on staff. And for almost my entire writing career, I was writing about the things I was doing and the stuff that I was working with. And so Electronic Musician was a magazine started by Craig Anderson. And Craig was originally working with a guy that used to make a DIY synthesizer kits, a guy named John Simonton, who was a real pioneer with this company, Paya. And he was being the publisher for Craig. And after a while, he was kind of getting tired of it going, I like this, but I'm not a magazine publisher. That's not what I do. And I had bumped into Craig at that time, and he'd showed me an early issue of Electronic Musician, which I took to Mix Magazine. And then Mix Magazine bought it. So I was kind of involved in that whole thing. And so I became involved in writing for Electronic Musician. And I did a lot of writing for Electronic Musician from early on all the way through. My brother ended up being the editor for about 17 years. So I was doing a lot of writing for him. But he was not. In the beginning, it was Craig Anderson. And then there were Bob O'Donnell and Mike Melenda, a few different editors. But all of that was writing about things either that I was working with or that interested me. The beauty of this whole writing side thing was that it was almost like doing school papers, in that I would be interested in something. I'd pitch the editors. Usually what I was pitching them was something that they thought would be cool. And they'd say, yeah, go ahead. And then I could call the top people who usually would never take a phone call from me because why would they? Right? But I use the magazine's name, and I get access to them, and I get to interview them and ask them all the questions I want to know about what they're talking about. And then I sit down and I carefully write it all up like a school paper, right? And I turn it in, I get paid a little bit of burrito money, and it gets published. And I know a lot more than I knew before because I got it straight from the horse's mouth. And so that whole thing was just, that whole period was really fertile. And again, it kind of went back and forth and interacted with the work I was doing at LucasArts. Some of the things I was learning about there, I brought into LucasArts. Some of the people I was talking to, I would tell them about what we were doing in games. Because again, at that time, games were just starting to game audio was really blossoming. I mean, for a lot of that stuff, Xbox wasn't even out yet. And then of course it came out and that changed things. So, it was just a parallel career that I stumbled into, and it worked really well for me because it turns out I discovered I'm a good writer, and I'm particularly good at explaining this stuff. And I had an opportunity to find out about things I wanted to learn about. So it was kind of a win-win-win all the way around. Occasionally, the workload got heavy because I was also, during the same period, working on other outside projects. I was playing in bands, but I was also working on other projects like the Vampire Hunter D movie, which was an anime movie, a big Japanese anime movie. Well, I was working on that while I was still at LucasArts full-time and writing. So there are times when I'd be pulling basically an all-nighter, and then because we didn't really have the internet, I would be driving from where I lived in San Francisco up to Marin, where the post-production supervisor for the movie lived, to deliver assets to him at like 7:30 in the morning and then driving over to LucasArts and working all day there and then coming home and working on an article. So things got pretty crazed for a while there. But it was exciting.
And each one of them probably had a tight deadline that she had to meet. So
the magazines had very tight deadlines. Yeah, they did, actually. They did all have pretty tight deadlines. That's true. Yeah, that's part of what made it so intense.
So how did you deal with the workload? Did you stop sleeping altogether?
At times, yeah. At times, it came pretty close to that. There were a few occasions where I actually used substances to help me, but I was always very wary of that. If used properly, they can be a functional help, but you can get yourself in trouble real easy. So I mostly stayed away from that. But there were times when everything was happening all at once when it's like, how am I going to get through this? But mostly it came down to, not a lot of sleep. I kind of had this thing where it's like, if I have less than 90 minutes, it's not worth going to bed. I was younger.
In 1998, you were credited for the robot dance mix on Star Wars Droid Works. Let's listen to a snippet of this amazing track. Do you remember this track?
And I don't. I'm waiting for you to play it.
There we go. So do you remember this track?
I have to be honest, I don't remember anything about that. I don't remember doing it. I didn't even remember the game until you put it up there. That's
wow.
I think I would probably credit that to what we were just talking about. That I was just going. And a lot of times, Mike and Pete and Clint really, there was a class that came after them, but they were the superstars. They were handling the big projects, and they were, and I was kind of the utility guy in a lot of ways. There'd be smaller needs, smaller projects, whatever. Somebody had to take care of it, and they were swamped with the bigger stuff, and they would just say, can you do this? And I'd say, yeah, sure. And so there were actually a number of things like that just passed through my hands when I was working on other stuff, and I would just crank it out and get it done. And most of them I at least remember that one. That one, that's a bolt out of the blue.
So the robot dance mix is credited to Clint Bajakian, Jeff Clement, Michael Land, David Levison, and you.
Well, the interesting thing about that is Jeff is a great audio engineer. He's one of the guys, I brought him over from Russian Hill, and I learned so much from him when he was an engineer at Russian Hill. But he was not a musician. He's a great engineer and sound designer. And I've got a short story about him that I'll tell you in a moment. But he wasn't a musician. Everybody else you named is a musician. Now, I wasn't doing that much music at LucasArts. Dave was, obviously Mike, Pete, and Clint all were. So I got a feeling this was a task that needed to get done, and everybody took a whack at part of it. And between all of us, we got it done. That's what it feels like. The thing I was going to say.
Maybe you added the fade out at the end.
Yeah, it could have been. You're exactly right. It could have been that, More likely, Jeff and I probably did the mix. Jeff probably did some of it, and I probably did some of it. And that's, the most likely thing. But the thing I remember about Jeff, we had a very brutal interview process in the sound department. We would, people would have to interview with the entire department, like a dozen people firing questions at them, plus all their interviews with project leads and all that. And then we would give them the Kobayashi Maru, the impossible test. We'd sit them down in a room with a system they'd never worked on before, with a sound library they had never seen before, software they'd never seen before, and we'd give them a scene, like a 45 second or 1 minute scene, and we'd say, score the scene, you have an hour, an impossible amount of time, just ridiculous. And The only person who actually solved it was Jeff. Because what Jeff did was, the first thing he did was he found a couple of ambiances. Okay, this is outdoors, this is a spaceship, and he just striped the ambiances in. So if he got nothing else done, there was still going to be sound. There was never going to be silence. And then it was just a matter of how much time do I have to put in other stuff. And he starts from the top with explosions or whatever, worked his way down. But he was the only one that realized, if I put ambience in first, I've always got sound. And no one else, everybody else would have like a few sounds here, a few sounds there, and a lot of silence. So yeah, Jeff was the only one that figured out the Kobayashi Maru.
And speaking of Michael Land, I forgot to ask Michael in my conversation with him what the Z stands for. And it seems like no one knows what the Z stands for. Is it Zoltan?
I can't help you. I actually, you're not going to believe this, Daniel. I had the exact same conversation with my wife 2 to 3 days ago. I told her I'd never asked him what the Z was for. Literally 2 to 3 days ago, I had this conversation. But I'm hoping to see him pretty soon, so I will ask.
No, don't ask him. You know what? I'll invite him for another conversation, and then I'll ask him.
I gotta ask him. I worked with the guy for years. I gotta ask him.
Ask him, but don't tell me the answer.
I won't tell you.
Ask him myself.
No, that's a good question to ask him. So I won't tell you. I'll leave you hanging.
Hopefully it's Zoltan, because all this time I've been certain that it's Zoltan, and he just hides it for some reason.
Well, you were probably going to get to this before too long, but on Escape from Monkey Island, it was interesting because we had Michael Land and Michael Landy, two different guys who both composed on it. Well, as I'm sure you know, when you look on the web, there's a lot of places that just credit Michael Land, and they don't get that there were two separate guys. So, I think that's one reason why he often goes by Michael Z. Land, to distinguish him from other Michael Lands and Michael Landys. I want to put a word in here for Mike, not as a creative guy. He's a brilliantly creative guy, but I learned so much about management from him. Yeah, he had his weak points, but there were things that he did. One was what I said before, being an advocate. There was one time, the one project I worked on, and it was Friday night at 1 a.m., right? I'm home sitting up in bed with my girlfriend. The phone rings. It's a project lead for a game I'm working on. And she wants to know if I'm coming in that weekend. And I'm like, no, it's Friday, 1 a.m. You guys aren't even ready for sound yet. And so I went in and I happened to mention that on Monday to Clint. And Clint is like, what? He was like outraged. He's like, wait till Mike hears this. And so the minute Mike walks in, Clint says, Mike, you got to hear this. And had me tell Mike what had happened. Mike immediately goes upstairs to the president of the company and says, look, nobody calls my guys at home at 1 a.m. on a Friday but me, and I don't call them at home. If they got a problem, they can call me. You don't go after my guys when they're getting their rest. He was just very protective. And, by the same token, one time a project lead came to him and complained that I wasn't delivering enough assets. And I was delivering lots of assets. And again, they would always do this when they weren't actually ready to handle sound yet. And so Mike said, okay, here's what you're going to do. You're going to sit down and you're going to track when you deliver every asset. And it's going to be a pain in the butt. It's going to take you time you really don't want to spend, but you are going to do this for 3 weeks. You are going to track every asset you send them. Then you're going to come to me with a spreadsheet. And so I did. And it took time. And it was, I was exhausted all the time. It's like, oh God, now I got to document this delivery. But then I went to him with a spreadsheet, and he went upstairs to the project lead and put it down and said, where's your problem? Look at how many assets have been delivered. Why are you complaining? So he was just really an active and protective advocate for his department. Same time, if you weren't coming through, he'd come lean on you, And there were 1 or 2 times when he had to lean on me, especially early on, pretty hard. But he was right. And, when somebody comes and kicks your butt, if you respect who they are, you think about it. You don't just like resent them for it or something. And he was right. And I just learned so much from him about how to operate in an environment like that. Not just how to work with the department, but sometimes how protective he was with other departments of us. And what a difference that made, the loyalty it inspired. If Mike came to me and said, I need you to do this thing, you're going to hate it, and it's going to really screw you up, but I need you to do it, I'm like, you bet, no problem, because I know he's got my back. That was really, really inspiring to work with him on that. The other inspiring thing I want to say about Michael Lamb was there are times when we'd be talking about something and he asked me a question, and I'd think, you're an audio professional. You ought to know the answer to that. I'm like, God, that's weird that he doesn't know. And then it kind of occurred to me, what's going on here is, no, he doesn't know. And so he's being unafraid to look unknowledgeable one time, and he'll ask the question straightforward without hesitation. Then I answer it, and then he knows. And he factors it into his worldview and his decisions going forward. It's like, wow, I have to respect that. He's unafraid to say, no, I don't know that. I'm ignorant. Teach me. Then I'll know. And he just, he had no hesitation about that. He wasn't worried about what somebody would think of him because he didn't know this thing, because in 5 minutes he was going to know it. And that, again, that was just a lesson for me. And I'm much more that way now. So I learned a lot from all those guys. I really did. Clint was interesting. If I'm getting off topic here, just stop me. But Clint was interesting because Mike is extremely analytical. He's Mr. Left Brain. He obviously has passion, but when you speak to him and when you work with him, it's his analytical side that really comes out. And Clint, who's been a friend of his since high school, is a flip side of the coin. He obviously knows his stuff, but what you see is the creative right brain, the intuitive. And in my early days at LucasArts, there were definitely times when I found myself, I wouldn't say explaining to Mike what Clint meant, but I was making Clint's case for him, because he would just make it in an intuitive way, and Mike wanted to hear it in an analytical way, and I was able to translate between the two. But seeing the two of them, and they were both, these really are brilliant guys, and seeing how differently they approached it, how tight they were as friends forever, just a lot of lessons. At the same time, it could get crazy there. When I first started there, I remember going to one of my, if not my very first department meeting, one of my first department meetings. And I was in Mike's office with Mike and Clint and Pete, and they disagreed about something. And they disagreed violently. And when I say violently, I mean at one point, Mike was kicking Clint. Right? Now, again, these guys are longtime friends, but they're yelling at each other. They're kicking each other. And I was literally cowering in the corner going, am I going to have to go buy some boxing gloves to work here? I was all freaked out. And I came to find out that the way they operated was what they called the Darwinism of ideas. If you brought an idea in, one of those three guys would bring it in. The first thing the other two guys would do is shoot it all full of holes. All to hell. And then whoever brought it in would go away with their tail between their legs. And then they'd come back 2 days later and they'd say, I thought about what you said, and we could do this and this and this. And then they'd try to shoot holes in it again, but they couldn't quite shoot as many holes. And then maybe the third time they come back, everybody go, yeah, that's it. That's the solution. We do that. And the company had gotten used to this. They were gotten used to hearing all this shouting and everything coming from this room and angry voices, and the door would open and the three of them would just come out shoulder to shoulder. And that's just how they operated. And it's like, I'd never seen people work that way before. It was just unfettered, And I can't say how much I learned from those guys. Just so much stuff. It was amazing.
In 1998, you were credited for sound design on Jedi Knight Mysteries of the Sith. What was it like to work on this expansion pack?
It was an expansion pack, so it wasn't really a huge project. And again, I'm being really honest. There was a lot going on all the time. So the bigger projects stick with you more, and some of the projects that weren't so big, they kind of came and you were in them and you did them, and then you moved on to something else and it left your head. So I do remember doing Mysteries of the Sith, but I don't remember very much about it. It also was a long time ago. Almost 30 years ago now, right? This is 2024, so that's close to 30 years since I did it. Something like that.
Do you think that the Star Wars projects were less memorable because you'd always have to work with a library of sounds and you'd always have the same guidelines for you to use certain sounds in certain locations in the game?
No, I think that a lot of the Star Wars projects had sequels. Sometimes there were smaller projects. And those generally did not make as much of an impression on you as the big sprawling projects where there were big problems and big breakthroughs and fireworks and that sort of thing. So some of these smaller Star Wars projects were more workmanlike, where they came, you worked on them, you did the work, and it wasn't like the work wasn't fun. It wasn't like the work wasn't interesting, but it wasn't as memorable in the sense of making a splash in your consciousness so much. But there was one exception that I alluded to a moment ago, and that you're probably going to get to this, which was Galactic Battlegrounds. Galactic Battlegrounds was a game. Gary Gaber was the project lead on that. And it was the only project that I can recall ever working on at LucasArts that came in on budget and on schedule. And the reason for that is because Gary defined it with a limited scope, not really small, but limited, and he stuck to it. People were constantly trying to grow the game, and he's like, no, we got to keep it like this. And that's why it was able to be delivered. But there were a few really interesting things that happened on that project. One was it was built on an engine that we licensed, which is the first time that I can recall that LucasArts had licensed an engine. And it was from a game called Age of Kings. And shortly after we licensed that engine, Microsoft bought the company that owned the engine. And Microsoft had no interest in helping us out. So we were kind of on our own. And it turns out the code was kind of spaghetti code. It was not really well-organized code. And the programmers were like, oh boy, this is going to be something. But then we discovered a worse problem, which is that the way it was structured, Age of Kings did not have a whole lot of content in it. LucasArts was known for having a whole lot of content. We always put a lot of content in stuff. And so even in a game that was relatively small like Galactic Battlegrounds, there was going to be a lot of content. And the way they had structured the engine, all of the content was in one giant blob file. So if you wanted to find a particular asset, it had to index through this giant file to find it. Well, you take this giant file and you make it way more giant, and suddenly you've got latency problems. You've got things that are just breaking down because, as you and I were just saying a moment ago, quantity breaks things. And that's what was happening here. And so the poor programmers on that whole project, they were trying to figure out the spaghetti code and find there just wasn't time to rewrite it from scratch. So they had to just do the best they could to find ways around this blob problem and, how to restructure the whole thing. So that was one part of it, which made it amazing that it came in on budget and schedule. For myself, one of the things that was interesting was they had an entire level that was on the Wookiee planet. And so I needed to have 6 dozen sentences, not just words, but sentences in Wookiee. And so I got all of the original Chewbacca material from Skywalker's Vault, and there wasn't very much. There really wasn't a lot. So I'm like, well, where am I going to get more material? So then I got all the material from the dreaded Star Wars Christmas special, which, yeah, exactly right.
Does George know about this?
I don't know if he knew personally, but we had access to the vaults. We got it from Skywalker. We couldn't just go there by ourselves and grab it. They had to give it to us. So, we were making a game. We're his company, and I needed Wookiee sounds, and they were not so great, those sounds. And
he tried to destroy every copy of the Christmas special, and apparently he has one in the LucasArts archives, in the Lucasfilm archives.
It was an embarrassment, yeah. and part of it was because they whipped it together real fast for TV. They did not go to the same lengths for sound design that the movies did. And this material was not that great. So I'm like, okay, I've got a small amount of Chewbacca material. I've got fairly small amount of this not very good material. And I need about 5 times more material than this. And so I had to figure out how to do it. So I took a lot of the Chewbacca material. I used the trick that I referred to earlier about pitch envelopes to change that so I could make a question out of something by making the intonation go up at the end, or vice versa. Take something where Chewie goes, "Roar," and I can make him go, "Roar." But that still wasn't enough. And I'm like, what was the source material for this? And it turns out the source material that Ben Burt used was a baby bear that he found at a zoo and he got access to. Most of those vocalizations were based on these baby bear vocalizations. And most sound libraries don't have baby bears. So I'm like, okay, what am I going to do? So I start going through. I mean, I didn't have time to go out to a zoo and record a lot of material for this. So I started going through our libraries, like every animal sound we have. And it's like, most of them are not that weird. But camels have weird vocalizations. They have all kind of, just really strange stuff. And I think I found it. And so I would combine Chewbacca stuff with camel stuff. I would process camel stuff. I'd modulate it or pitch shift it I just used every trick that I learned of sound design to try and get this much material out of this much material. And in the end, I finally managed it, and it sounded, pretty good. But that was an adventure. It was stressful, but really fun, because it's where you get to call on your creativity and go, okay, I need every trick I've ever learned. And if I can invent a couple of new tricks along the way, that'd be good too. And so that's how I ended up doing it. And that project, like I said, came in on budget and on schedule. And it was not a huge, earth-shaking success, but it was profitable. So, it did what it was supposed to do. It's actually seeing a game made on time and on budget.
In 1998, you were also credited as studio engineer on the Star Wars Trilogy arcade. Well, what was it like working on an arcade game after working on PC and console games for so long?
Well, as studio engineer, like I say, I had helped get that studio built. And until Jeff Kleiman came in, which was a couple years later, I was the only one that was like an accomplished studio engineer. So I did a lot of stuff where the only thing I worked on was recording source material, sometimes editing source material, sometimes mixing source material. I might mix music that somebody else had recorded for a game. So in this instance, in this game, I think all I was doing was recording some people. At that time, we were just starting to be able to use more digital audio, but there was still a lot of sample stuff going on and, MIDI playing samplers. And so what we did was we would have a MIDI orchestra or whatever, and then Mike or Peter Clint usually would bring in one or two or three or four multi-instrumentalists, really good players who could play a bunch of different instruments. And then we would record tracks of them playing all these different instruments, playing different parts, mix it in with the samples, and suddenly everything sounded much more alive. Just having one or two or three tracks of a real player that you mixed in with a sample made all the difference in the world. So I often would be the person that would be recording some of these guys. And some of them were great musicians, like Paul McCandless would come in, and we got some really good musicians that would come in. Joe Craven came in, and so a lot of my work, when I'm credited as studio engineer, I really didn't even get involved in the game. I was just involved in helping to produce the assets, especially the original source material for the assets.
I see. Okay. In 1999, you were credited for sound design on Star Wars Episode 1, The Gungan Frontier. Well, what can you tell me about the production of this game?
Well, everything around Episode 1 was really, really interesting because obviously there was all this secrecy about it. And the secrecy was very intense. Everybody at LucasArts was already under a non-disclosure agreement, but they made us sign additional non-disclosure agreements just for the Episode 1 material. And you were not allowed to see the script for the Episode 1 material. If you had a game that involved something from the movie, you would go to a room, they would sign you in, there would be a guard, there'd be a copy of the script there that usually was just an excerpt from the script that applied to what you were doing. And you could go in there and you could read it, and then that's it. You couldn't take it with you. You did not have any reference material. You could just read it. You couldn't take pictures of it, nothing. So, and not only that, but they actually set up a whole different area of LucasArts. They pretty well literally walled off a section of LucasArts to work on the Episode 1 stuff. And, you couldn't talk to anybody about what you were doing that wasn't working on Episode 1. And they discouraged you from talking to people who were working on a different Episode 1 game than you. Everybody worked there. We were all friends. If we were under an NDA already, we weren't that shy about talking to each other, because part of the whole interesting thing about producing interactive material is that the interaction between the people is part of what develops good interaction in the game. Being able to run your ideas by somebody else and get their reaction to it is part of the process. So, we did try not to talk to people who weren't working on EP1 games. And some of the people not working on EP1 games were kind of bummed. And others of them were like, I am so happy to not be in the middle of that muck, because it was just people were very nervous about the EP1 stuff. So you were working from not much information, and you didn't really even get to see the game developing the way you usually would. A lot of times you would deliver assets and only the programmers were integrating everything. And very few people besides the level designers and the programmers, and obviously the project leads, were seeing the larger picture come together. And that was a little difficult at times. Mostly, if you were experienced at working on Star Wars games, you kind of knew the routine. And so it was handleable. It was kind of frustrating, but it was dealable. And this is just the way it was, right? So working on all of the episode 1 stuff was kind of that way. I remember when Jeff Climate was working on Racer, and he really had it that way because Racer was supposed to be a pretty big game, and the racing thing was a big scene in the movie. And he was trying to talk to Ben Burt about the sound design so we could get the engines right and all this stuff. And every step of the way, there was friction and resistance to allowing him to get the information that he needed. So that was basically the experience of working on any of the EP1 games. They all kind of fell into that bucket.
And did you get to watch an early screening of episode 1 while working on the game?
Not while working on the game, no. Basically, the whole point was to have a whole crop of games ready for release when the movie was released. But we did get to see a pre-release version of the movie, actually at the same theater where I think George had seen his very first screening of the very first of episode 4 in Corte Madera. And so, and what was interesting about that was, we were working on some games, but we knew that they were just the beginning. And so when we went to see the movie, everybody else that's there, like from ILM and all that, they're seeing the first Star Wars movie in whatever it was, 20, 30 years. We're seeing our future for the next 4 or 5 years. So it's like when Jar Jar came out, half of LucasArts just went, it's like, we're going to be stuck with this guy. And the next day, the day after the screening, in the test pit, those guys, they know you to the bone. They had a whiteboard with all these sayings on them. One of them was like, "Use the people going to die? No, just you, Jar Jar." Or my favorite was Jar Jar, the other white meat. So, it was pretty crazy. And then after the screening, there was a huge party that George was at. And it was, I think that was kind of a general pre-release party because it was all of the Lucas companies plus various obvious friends of George and other people involved in the movie. That was an interesting experience. It's a shame that it wasn't a better movie, but it was an interesting experience working on it. Another interesting thing about that, and this is real insider stuff, was of course we were getting a lot of the sound effects from the vault to use in the games, from Skywalker, and we had gotten Star Wars effects all along from Skywalker, and the old ones, of course, had been transferred from tape to digital. When we got these new ones, we'd open up the files, and they had been gain maximized. Gain maximization was an audio process that was relatively new at the time, not brand new, but relatively. These things have been gain maximized to within less than an inch of their lives. You'd open up a file and look at the waveform, and it was just a black brick. The whole thing was, it was just like, how loud can we possibly get this? Because it's going to compete with explosions and John Williams and everything else. And the older effects had not been that crushed. They were compressed, but not even remotely close. The first time I opened up a file from episode 1, I was like, I'm looking at it going, wait, is this right? And I had to shrink, zoom out. And then finally it started to come down. I'm like, yeah, I guess that passes for a waveform under these circumstances. So yeah, they made those effects super, super hot.
Okay, now brace yourself. In the year 2000, you were credited as sound development supervisor and audio engineer on Escape from Monkey Island. About a year ago, I talked to Mike Stanley about the game, and I asked him about the monkey combat section, for which he issued an apology on his LinkedIn page. Now, one issue I had with that part of the game is the repetitive monkey sound effects. Each move had exactly one sound effect with no variations. So performing the same move repeatedly results in hearing the same sound effect over and over again. Let me demonstrate.
Eek, eek, eek.
Yeah, where's the problem?
So Mike said that he didn't take part in choosing these sound effects and told me to talk to the sound department guys. So in my conversation with Melina Annabelle, who was the sound department coordinator, I asked her about the monkey sound effects. And she advised me to reach out to Clint Bajakian, which I did. And here's what Clint had to say.
My memory is that it was all handled in-house and that I, as an external contractor, was hired just to produce the musical score. But if there were three monkeys, it almost sounds as though Larry the O might have contacted Michael, Peter, and I and said, you guys are going to be the three monkeys. But I'm completely speculating there. I have no idea.
Now I'll have to interview Larry the O. And you know what he'll say? He'll say that it was someone else who worked on the sounds.
Yes.
I'll eventually go through the internal list of LucasArts employees in order to find that, I don't know, the janitor added the sound effects to the game. So this was my conversation with Clint Bajakian. So now that we know what Mike, Melina, and Clint had to say, what do you have to say for yourself?
I'd say you should probably talk to Mike Stemley. No. I mean, if I pass the buck, I'm actually probably being honest on this, because that level of sounds, I was probably not dealing with directly. I probably handed it off to one of our junior guys to do. And that's
I need a name.
You have no shame. You just want to drag somebody down. Somebody's got to take the fall. Daniel's not satisfied till somebody takes the fall in monkey combat. Well, that's how monkey combat works, isn't it? Somebody's got to take the fall. Well, that's tough, because that was one of those games where the game got in some trouble and I was given several extra people for a while. So it's hard to say exactly. It might have been Micah Frayne. Could have been David Collins. At one point I had 3 or 4 guys working as assistants to me, and that is exactly the kind of task that I was handing off to them, because I had a lot of work to do on the music on that. There was really a lot of work on the music. So I definitely did do a lot of the sound design work, but some of it, the stuff that I didn't feel like I had to have my hands on personally, I did hand off to people. I wouldn't put it past Mike Stemley to have said, let's just have the sound, let's just mess with people and have it be repetitive. I don't know that he did that, but Stemley's not beyond something like that. He's not beyond messing with people. This is the guy that did Afterlife, right? I mean, he's not beyond tweaking the audience a little bit, especially because Monkey has always had, these staunch fans. So I'm probably just setting him up, but I mean, I got to get myself off the hook somehow. So.
Okay, so now I'll get Mike Stanley for another conversation, and then we'll see what he has to say for himself. That's the circle of life. I keep talking to people to find who worked on the monkey sounds in Monkey Combat.
Well, you do have to keep in mind what I've been saying all along, that making these games is a form of combat. There is a fog of war that happens. And sometimes you really don't remember exactly who did something, whether you handed it off or did it yourself. There are other times when people have said, I know you did this yourself because whatever, somebody told me, and I'm like, I didn't remember doing it. And the other way around. I've talked to some of the other guys in the sound department and said, yeah, I remember when you did this. And, Clint might say, no, I didn't do that. I'm like, yeah, I was standing there over your shoulder when you did it. So you don't always remember every detail because things are happening hot and heavy. And it was decades ago at this point.
Wait, so as the sound development supervisor, you also were in charge of the music?
I was the audio lead, basically the audio director. Sound development supervisor was actually that was a departmental title, not a game-related title. What that basically meant was that I was leading the technological charge for the sound department. I researched networks early on, and I wrote the sound library, and so a lot of the advancements in audio and somewhat in computer technology, I was kind of the tip of the spear. That's what sound development supervisor was about. Or if I wasn't, if somebody else was, I'd be kind of guiding the effort some, making sure that it would dovetail with everything else we were doing. So sound development supervisor was not related to a specific game. That was a more departmental function. But I was the sound lead on Monkey. And there was a tremendous amount of music from like 5 or 6 different composers. It also was the last game that iMuse was used on. And it was a digital audio version of iMuse. I think it's the only game that a digital audio version of iMuse was used on.
No, the Dig had the digital version of iMuse as well.
Okay, well, it must have been that came out first. I'm not sure that Full Throttle did it? It
had iMuse, yeah.
Okay, I'll take your word for that. That's when I joined was here. Since we're into it, that modular synthesizer and that digital delay that I mentioned earlier, where this currently hangs.
Wow.
I've been
offered
the
original one
or
or from the limited run games edition?
No. This is from the time.
Wow.
For that matter, this is also from the time.
You can sell it on eBay. Wow.
I've been offered pretty good money for these. I've just been the bandana I'm going to keep. The CD, maybe one of these days I'll sell it. But that's when I joined LucasArts, was they were doing Full Throttle. And I can still remember one of my first days, Pete and Clint were mixing. And that consisted of looking at a build of the game, making notes of what sounded wrong, then going to the programmer and saying, you need to adjust this sound by 2 dB and this sound by 4 dB and this sound by whatever. And then waiting for the programmer to change the levels or move it in time and do another build. And 4 days later, another build comes back. And then you sit down and listen to it and go, no, that was too much. You need to bring it back up a little more. And I'm looking at them going, you call this mixing? This is insanity. It's like, this is crazy. And that was actually one of my very first impressions of making games was, this is insanity. How do you get anything done this way? So I'll take your word for it. I don't remember iMuse being used on that, but I'll trust you on it.
The iMuse system is credited in Full Throttle and in the Dig, and that's why Michael, Clint, and Peter are credited for iMuse.
Well, but iMuse was originally a MIDI system, and then digital audio was added.
I know, and then they moved to digital audio because in Full Throttle you don't have MIDI. It's mainly digital audio.
So, well, like I say, I'll take your word for that. It's been a long time. But in any event, they added a lot to iMuse before Monkey. And so I was using a version that had a lot of new stuff in it. And I was, figuring that out as I went along. And some of it was really fun and worked well. For example, there's one place where you are going to the pirate retraining island. And as you're being sent there, the music, Clint did music that was all in a major key. No. I think as you go there, it's in a minor key because you're really sad. And then when you're on your way back, it's in a major key. And that was all. I was able to program that in iMuse so that there was like a threshold as you were sailing. And when you crossed the threshold, the key would modulate from minor to major or major to minor, depending on which direction you were going. So it detect your location and your direction of travel, and it would change which file it was playing depending on that.
So back then, when you worked on Escape, did you know that this would be the last time you'd use, or LucasArts would use the IMU system? What,
Yeah,
did it feel like
pretty
they
much.
were phasing it out at the time?
Yeah, I mean, Mike and Pete were just saying this is getting really hard, and we don't have the bandwidth to maintain this. It's big, and digital audio involves a lot of challenges that are harder than MIDI. Because you're dealing with samples, etc. And also some of it was compressed. It's really hard if you're dealing with MP3s because the way MP3 encodes is in blocks of samples. And so that makes it much harder to be absolutely precise about where something's going to land because you can't specify the sample. It's a block of samples. And if that block doesn't land in the right place, then you can't synchronize to exactly where you want to. So there were just a lot of reasons that digital audio was going to be much harder to do in iMuse. And having done what they had already done, they were realizing, this is just going beyond what we can do as a practical matter and still produce games. If there had been a company that was just doing iMuse, then it might have been a different thing, but there wasn't. It was being done in-house. And that was right as the corner was being turned when people were starting to use, engines like Unreal. I mean, just starting to license Unreal. Just a few games were doing it. And when there was just starting to be some middleware for sound and, these things were nascent and they just said, that's what's coming and we can go that direction. But it's just too hard for us to maintain this and make it do what we want and still be able to produce games, still be able to write music. So, yeah, I did kind of know that was going to be the last hurrah for iMuse. And, one thing I kind of regretted was I wanted to really flex its muscles and go crazy with it. But the priority is bring the project to a successful conclusion. And if I can pull my nice big tricks while I'm doing that, fine. And if I can't, So I was able to do a few fun things, but not as much as I'd hoped. There were some capabilities in there that I was not able to use just because of the amount of time it would have taken to make it work. But it was still really fun programming iMuse. It was pretty cool.
Up until that point, most Monkey Island games would have either one composer when it was Michael Land or three composers when it was Peter, Michael, and Clint. How did you handle 5 composers for this game?
Well, it was interesting. Clint handled it actually in terms of making sure that they all did managing who was doing what piece and making sure they were getting it done. And then once they were delivering assets, that's where I took over. And the difficult part about it really was kind of more of a mastering challenge because they did not necessarily all sound really close to each other the way they produced music. And I had to kind of make it all fit. But I really enjoyed that challenge, and I enjoyed, putting the music in. They all did a great job. Anna Carney did a great job. You're in the lava field, and she's got these big drums going on, and it was the music was all very good. The fact that it came from different composers was tricky, but it was not anything that was beyond. By that point I'd mastered some albums. In fact, there was an album of music from the Gone Jackals, not the soundtrack album, but they put out an album that included the music they did for it, and I had mastered that album. And so I had some mastering experience under my belt, and that really came into play. And having this music from different sources, on a few occasions I'd call them up and I'd say, look, this is just so different from what I got from this other composer. Can you remix it a little and take this down a little and bring this up a little or make it a little brighter or whatever? Didn't have to do that much, only when things were like going to be right up against each other and they sounded so different that it was hard to match them. But what made it work really was, this was probably Clint, the way he mapped out what composer was working on what section. So there was some separation between them. In other words, there'd be all the music in the lava field, but then it did not usually abut directly up against music for the next scene. There would be at least a little bit of silence in between. And a little bit of silence can go a long way when you're trying to cover over very different sounds. Plus, musically, in terms of genres, the music is really different. Now, some of those composers, like Michael Landy, he did all this stuff and then just sent it in. But the stuff for Mike and Pete and Clint, most of the music tracks I recorded at the LucasArts studio. And so we got really good, nice recordings, and I had the multi-tracks, and though I had to mix them extremely quickly, at least it was within my control, and it was really fun working on some of that music, like Peter McConnell's underwater music was just wonderful. He's doing all this bassoon stuff, and it was just really fun. We got Paul Hansen in, who's just an incredible bassoonist that's worked with Cirque du Soleil and all these other people, and real quality people in. And since I had come along, I had also gotten the studio stocked with some really nice sounding equipment, good mics and mic pre's. So the stuff that we recorded for Monkey at LucasArts Studio came out pretty well, and it was easier for me to get a more consistent sound across the different composers. And that was, I really enjoyed the recording and mixing of the stuff that I did there. And I enjoyed the programming in iMuse. There were a few tricks that I was able to play. There's a bank that you go into. And the bank music was this, bright sort of 1950s sounding bouncy music. And then you go back later to the bank and it's nighttime and everything's dark. And you go in there and you flip on the lights and then you execute what you're supposed to execute in there. So what I did was I programmed it so that when you go in there at night, it's silent. And when you flip on the light, I took one of the pieces of music and I used pitch grading to sound like a phonograph coming up the speed. So when you flip on the light, it sounds like you turn on a record player that's coming up the speed and playing the bank music. And so programming that sort of stuff in iMuse was fun. So Monkey was a big project. It was a relatively stressful project, but it was a really fun project. I mean, it's Monkey Island, man.
I know. Now, in 2001, you were credited for sound design on Star Wars Galactic Battlegrounds. But since we talked about that, we're going to skip to 2002, in which you were credited as lead sound designer on Star Wars Bounty Hunter. Now, earlier this month, on August 1st, Bounty Hunter Remastered was released, and so I'll finally get a chance to play it since I didn't have a PS2 or a GameCube when the original came out. Did you get a chance to play or take part in the creation of this remastered version of the game?
No. That was the game on which I crashed and burned. That was a very, very difficult project. It was large and it was ambitious. And going into just a little bit of personal opinion here, the difficulty that I had at LucasArts a lot of the time was that the company was ambitious, and that, as I've said before, a lot of the time, what the technology did not yet exist to do with it, what people were committing themselves to doing. And so, it's like, we're going to do this and we're going to add these mechanics and do that, but they did not yet exist. So it was all somewhat speculative. And it was educated speculation. It wasn't wild speculation, but still, things often prove to be more difficult than you think. And the problem came that they would define these games as being huge. There'd be like 25 or 30 levels, and we're going to add all these new mechanics and all this sort of stuff. And there was never a fallback plan. So when something went wrong and they could not actually achieve what they wanted to, which could be anything from they couldn't get the technology to work to simply things were taking too long and they're running out of time, that often what would happen would be a very brutal sort of surgery where, okay, we have to remove 9 levels. And that would happen mid-development. And now they have to figure out how to make the story work, having pulled 9 levels out. And plus, it was not always communicated. The communication did not always proliferate through the entire team the way that it should have. So, there was literally times when I'd go get a cup of coffee and somebody would be talking about 6 levels that just got cut. And I'd go, what? And that's how I'd find out that 6 levels had been cut. So it was a very, very difficult project that way. They were trying to do great stuff, and I think the game in the end probably turned out well, but it got very bad, and there were a lot of people, not just me, who were really having a difficult time with the production process. I don't want to point fingers at any one person, because I don't think it was any one person. I think it was more kind of systemic management, rather than an individual person or how something was structured. But that was the project in which I ended up leaving LucasArts, because I got to the point where I was having physical symptoms. I was having anxiety attacks, like real dizzy, clammy skin, heart pounding. I'd never had anything like that before never before or since. And at that point, it was just kind of like, I love this job, but no job is worth killing myself. And so I just kind of went, check please. And I was actually being recruited at that point by Electronic Arts, coincidentally. The timing was just coincidental. I had not reached out to them. They'd reached out to me. And so that was the point at which I parted ways with LucasArts and did not actually finish the project, which I was really sad about, but I hit the wall. What are you going to do? It was.
So what was it? The long hours, the studio intervention, the fact that the entire production process was disorganized. What exactly? Because I presume that not all projects were well organized during your time at LucasArts. So
that's true. Yeah, and it was a problem that would happen repeatedly. That was the problem that I had, was that the next game would come along and they would define that with a huge scope and not really have a fallback plan for that either. In fairness, people were figuring out as they went along how to produce games of this size and how to create the new tools to do it. And that's extremely difficult stuff. For Bounty Hunter, for me, it was a combination of all the factors that you mentioned, but more that all those factors were in extremis. That the hours were, I literally worked 100 or 200 hour weeks. There's only 168 hours in a week. And it took me 45 minutes to drive each way to my house. So, if I'm doing a 100-hour week and I'm working 7 days a week and it's taking me 10 hours of the remaining 60 hours just to drive, let alone sleep, that's why I started having these physical symptoms. It was just, there were many things that obviously there were details, that dirty laundry that I don't need to air. But it was just a project that, to say it didn't agree with me is to be generous. It was destroying me. And I did not destroy everybody that worked on it. I think it's partly because of my position, being the audio director, and there were just a lot of things. For example, just to give you one example of one thing that happened, a new sound engine was written for it. But for one reason or another, no front end was written for that new sound engine. No way of actually getting the sound into the game. There was an engine to play it, but there was no front end for wiring sounds. And I'm like, whoa, how the heck am I supposed to get sound into it? And I went to the tools group, and they were killer swamped with a million other things to do. And it was hard for me to get them to spend more time on the sound engine. And finally, they said, look, we can give you a text, a formatted text file. If you give us a formatted text file in this format, then we can put that into the engine. And so I had to come up with a way to wire sounds and then generate this formatted text file from it. And what I ended up doing was I used, at that time, I did a lot of taking FileMaker and AppleScript, which is a very slow scripting language that is really excellent at coordinating different applications. And so I wrote this whole extremely elaborate system that would allow me to wire the sounds, and then FileMaker would generate this text thing. But because it was for an entire game, it was huge. And so what I would do is I would wait until the entire rest of the sound department left and went home, and then I would employ everybody's machine in the department running a separate chunk of this task. And one of them would crash after 4 hours, and I'd have to restart it. And it would took me 30 hours to generate this text document. And obviously that was just not tenable. And eventually there started to be people in management going, why is this not getting done? And, they started asking questions, and I explained it. And at that point, somebody with a lot more authority than me went to the tools group and said, I know you're busy, but this problem needs to be solved. And within a day or two, they had a front end where we could put the sound in an hour or an hour and a half instead of in 30 hours. So it was just many, many, many issues like that. I spent 3 weeks putting that system together, and I was supposed to be focusing on other things, but I was just being the good soldier trying to get it done, And again, I don't want to point fingers at any one person because I do not think it was any one person. I think everybody was swamped and everybody was in battle and doing the best they could. And, if I had to do it over again, I would probably throw a tantrum. That's probably what I would have done. I would have gone to my boss or gone to the project lead, and I would have just, lost it and screamed and shouted to get their attention and say, this is really serious. But at the time, I didn't think that was a constructive approach. And maybe it wasn't. I mean, who can say, It was just a difficult environment, and I don't know that anybody was necessarily screwing up. It was just the way it was structured was not functioning smoothly for sound anyway. I can't speak for the rest of the game, but for sound, it was just very, very challenging. And I mean, some of the other guys you'll talk to about that game might be disappointed to hear some of my comments, and I don't want to be putting people down because that's not how I felt. But it was bad for me. It was bad.
Sad to hear that the year prior to that you had a great experience with Galactic Battlegrounds, and then
Monkey
2002, just the year after, yeah.
Well, there's even more than that going on. I told you that I was a utility player, and what happened also was there was we were starting to do more licensing outside people to develop games, and I was assigned to be supervising those. And so at one point I had 4 games that I was responsible for, not directly. 2 or 3 of them I was supervising outside people, and a couple of them were inside. And it was just an excessive workload. And again, I mean, I keep saying this, but I think it's true. It's not like one person screwed up. It was just the way things unfolded. After that, at one point they brought in the guy that had been running ILM to try and run LucasArts. And he came in and took one look at how things were working. He was going, you guys are crazy. How can you get anything done this way? It was just, the game industry was in development, and there's a lot of pain involved in developing anything new. I mean, this is not the only place that I've been that was at the cutting edge where new things were being developed. And the thing that you learn about that is when you're at the cutting edge, everyone is making it up as they go along. Because the only way it could be otherwise, the only way anybody could know what they're doing is if it had been done before. And if it hasn't been done before, then there's going to be failures, there's going to be pain, there's going to be problems. That's the nature of advancing. That's the nature of innovation. And that was what was going on here. But I had numerous games. There were big problems for me in that particular game, and it just all added up to, not working. It was sad, it was bad, but this is life.
Still in 2002, you received special thanks on Star Wars Jedi Starfighter and were credited under the name Lawrence Oppenheimer, not Larry Dio, as they usually credited you. What did you do to earn this special thanks?
Well, if I recall correctly, that was Stan that did that. And I think he was just also overwhelmed by the project. And I dived in just the way I was describing to you before. I just pitched in and said, Stan, what can I do to help you? And he said, you can do this, you can take this off my head, and you can do that. And I just did whatever I could to lighten his load. And that's why it was a special thanks. I don't think I was officially on the crew, but I actually didn't even know I ever got that credit, let alone under the name Lawrence Oppenheimer. I have to tell you, I fought for years to get my credits under the name Larry the O. And when I was doing a lot of writing for the magazines, and I went to the editor of Electronic Musician, and I wanted to be Larry the O, and he said, well, I don't feel like we can do that. And I was like, why not? And he said, well, I think it kind of undermines the credibility of the magazine to have a name like that. And I said, if the credibility of your magazine rests on what one person's byline looks like, you got bigger problems than my byline. And the way I finally convinced him was I told him that I had registered it as a fictitious business name, which at that time I had not, but I did subsequently. For whatever reason, that convinced him. And then I started getting credits as Larry the O. So I don't know why that credit at LucasArts appeared as Lawrence Oppenheimer. Probably I'd already left by then. and they gave that credit to me afterwards. I'm just guessing.
They wanted to be more formal about their special things.
Yeah.
Or maybe they feared that you got that name trademarked, and so you'd sue LucasArts for them using your trademark name.
That actually would have been really great. That would have been precious. Not many people sue George for trademark infringement. Usually he's the one doing it. There was when we did Jedi Knight and we were doing the Dolby Pro Logic, and LucasArts Legal needed to have a form from Dolby indemnifying them, because there were occasionally lawsuits against Dolby for their logo, for their Double D logo. And LucasArts said, we're not going to field lawsuits against you. And Dolby, they have a pretty vicious legal machine, and they weren't going to do it. And it finally came down to having to call a vice president of Dolby when he was on vacation and saying, if we don't have this form by 10 a.m. tomorrow, we're not using Dolby in this game. And they really wanted, like I say, it was the first game that was going to have surround cutscenes. And so finally the VP picked up the phone and called his office and went, what the heck is going on? Send them what they need. And so, the battle of the legal teams. So if I'd sued LucasArts, I would have been crushed like a bug, but it still might have been a fun thing to think about. Actually, the reality is I was actually really tight with the legal guys at LucasArts. I was actually, as sound development supervisor, part of my task was I was the liaison to legal. And there were a number of times that I worked with legal on different matters. There was one time. There was one time there was a company that I'm not going to name that was early into doing sound modeling. And I knew the guys running the company. And I had figured out we would have things like lightsabers where you have entire lightsaber fights. And it's really a pain in the neck to create a huge library of lightsaber swings and try and create an algorithm to draw from this library and play samples. And a model would be a much easier way to go. Now, of course, at the time, models took a lot of CPU. It wasn't clear that we could do it. But I brought this company into LucasArts, and we had some meetings, and they started working on this model. Well, needless to say, they were under an incredibly tight non-disclosure agreement and only need-to-know basis. And then I went to a trade show, and I walk onto a booth, and this company is showing the lightsaber sound on the booth. And so I had a friend that was one of the marketing guys at the company, and I went down and I found him, and he was in conversation, and I said, I need to talk to you right now. And he said, well, can I wait a second? And I said, no. And he did kind of a double take, like, oh, he wasn't expecting no. And then when he came over, I said, look, as part of my job, I have to report this. And you and I both know it's not supposed to be here. He was shocked to hear it was there. He knew nothing about it. What happened was just some low-level guy that was doing demos decided to bring it because it would be fun. And so I pulled him aside and I said, you got to shut that down or our legal guys are going to be all over your case. I don't have a choice here. It's my job, And so he went upstairs and he shut it down like that because the guy wasn't even supposed to have access to it, let alone bring it out to a show. So, I sort of saved them from getting roasted on a spit, as it were. But there were a couple times. There was another time when somebody used a Star Wars thing in an ad for a music company, and they clearly didn't have permission. And I kind of had to go to them and sort of say the same thing and say, I would just suggest you take that ad down because otherwise it's going to go badly for you. And I felt bad being the heavy, but that's where I worked. That was part of my responsibility, So
I know that George isn't used to getting sued, but when they worked on the special editions of the Secret of Monkey Island and Monkey Island 2, they removed all of the 7 Max cameos because back when they worked on the original games, Steve Purcell was part of the company. And so he added 7 Max cameos to the game itself. But in the special editions, they removed all of them because probably, even though Steve wouldn't sue them for using the the Sam Max likeness in the special editions, they didn't want to take that chance.
Yeah, it might be that they owned the Sam Max assets that had been used in their games, but they did not. Well, I guess maybe they didn't if they took that out. But obviously, it would seem like they didn't own Sam Max, as it were. They might, whatever deal they had with Steve, he must have retained, copyright or ownership.
Yeah, so, he still owns Sam Max. Sam Max is a licensed property and not something owned by LucasArts. The only thing that LucasArts owns is Sam Max Hit the Road, and the story and the newly developed characters in that game, but they don't own Sam Max.
Well, Sam Max existed before they did the game, didn't it?
Yep.
Yeah, so that would be why. It was always Steve's property, and he just licensed them, as you say, for the game. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that was just a bit before my time with Sam Max stuff. LucasArts did some really fun games. I always liked the adventure games. Those were some of my favorites. So.
Now, in 2003, as you said, you started working as an audio director at EA, where you worked for about 6 months.
Yeah.
Now, you worked on the then upcoming James Bond game, which turned out to be 007 Everything or Nothing, which was Pierce Brosnan's last performance as James Bond. But you're not credited on the game, as far as I know. What can you tell me about your work on this game and about your time at EA in general?
They had told me that I would be credited on the game. Like I say, EA had recruited me, and I went over there to interview and did a bunch of interviews, and I basically said to them, look, I don't mind working hard. I like working hard, but there's a limit, as we were just discussing before. I said, if there's a couple of weeks of crunch, that's okay. If there's a month, I can handle that. If there's even 2 months or 3 months, I don't like that, but I can do it. But if it's like crunch time from beginning to end, that's what I just finished, and I really don't want to do that. And I was assured, no, we might crunch for a couple of weeks at a time, but that's about it. Well, that was not the case. From the moment I walked in, for the entire time I was there, it was the same thing that I've been going through on Bounty Hunter. But EA was structured totally differently. Whereas LucasArts had a sound department and the resources could be moved around flexibly, EA, each game was very siloed and had its own team, and that was it. And so if you ran into problems and needed more labor, you had to contract somebody outside. You had to get budget for that. It was just a lot harder to get things done in that sense. And EA was more hard-ass in the sense that they had no compunctions about firing people if they felt like something wasn't going well. And by the time, shortly after I left EA, almost everybody else who'd been on that team, I mean, the director and the lead programmer and a whole bunch of others had all been fired or left. A lot of them had been fired. So, there were some great people there. There was some good technology there. But again, it was just the way that the system was set up and run was brutal. It just was not, to my way of looking, I just didn't understand how they even were able to make profitable games that way. Obviously, they did so. They got to be a very big company. So what do I know? But from where I was, it was just very difficult. I mean, in the end, when they finally laid me off, it's because I hadn't gotten there until 10 a.m. on a Sunday. And that was the reason that they finally decided, after having worked 3-4 weeks in a row without a day off, maybe 5. So it was just brutal. It was also very difficult because EA had a bunch of different studios, and the studio in Canada had done a lot of racing games. So they wanted them to do the racing levels, which meant that 2 different studios were working on this game. And I was supposed to be the audio director, but the woman in Canada who was, supposed to be under me was an accomplished audio director herself who'd been at EA. And she very rightly chafed a bit, and like suddenly she has to report to this other guy who just came in. And I at least had the grace to realize, this woman knows exactly what she's doing and I don't. And so I pretty much said, look, let's just coordinate and keep in touch. I'm not going to tell you what to do because you know what to do way better than I do. So, and so we ended up getting along just fine. But that did make for yet one more complication, having a separate studio doing part of the game. I think they were also doing the motion capture up there. So it was just the way the whole thing was structured was it was very hard to succeed. And then on top of that, LucasArts was privately held. EA was publicly held. And so you'd be working along. And of course, production has an arc to it. And the arc has certain points that move slower, certain points that move faster. But every 6 weeks, maybe even less, every 5 weeks, they'd come to us and say, we need to do a demo for shareholders meetings. So you had to stop everything you were doing, build a demo. A lot of stuff didn't exist, so you'd have to fake it up for the demo. And then when the demo was, and so you'd spend like a week and a half putting this together frantically. Then they'd have the meeting. Then you'd have to spend another half a week to a week pulling all that fake stuff out. And so now you've just lost 2.5 weeks for, you've got nothing to show for it. So there were just many, many things. And like I say, it was still the same crazy, insane hours. And I'm like, this is what I just got out of. And so again, I didn't show up till 10 a.m. on a Sunday, and that was the end of it for him. And then, like I say, it was not a good scene. It really, I can remember talking to the lead sound programmer, and countless times I'd be talking to him at like 7 or 8 at night, and he's saying goodnight to his little girl over the phone. Over and over and over again, he's saying goodnight to her on the phone. And I'm like, okay, that marriage isn't going to last, And lots of relationships were breaking up. That was right around the same time, this whole bounty hunter in the period I was at EA. Do you remember the EA spouse thing? There was a woman that did a blog post, and she signed it EA spouse. And she talked about how her husband worked for EA and how it was destroying their marriage because he was always, always, always working. When he came home, he was exhausted. He was burnt out. He was, irritable, that they basically had no more. And at that same time, also, a group of artists filed a suit against EA because they weren't being paid for any overtime. So all the stuff was coming to a head right in this period. This was, I think, a peak in the bad labor period of the game industry. And from what I gather, there's still a lot of similar stuff that goes on, but I don't think it's quite as bad as it was at that particular point in time. Because, everybody was salaried, so nobody got paid overtime, or at least people that I worked with were. So the only comfort to me was that I could see signs that other people were having the same feelings about it just being, in my mind, just not humane. And but also, I didn't understand how you could get good creative work out of people under those circumstances. Good creative work was done, but from the inside, I found it difficult it was hard to believe that it wouldn't be much better if it wasn't quite so brutal. I don't mind production. I don't mind working really hard. I like it. But there is just a limit to what the human body and mind and spirit are built to do. And I think that, in film, you got the same thing, but it was more limited in the amount of time. It might be 4 to 6 weeks. It might be 3 months, maybe, but then it's done. And in games, one of the other things that happened was when they started doing E3, all of a sudden, there was a new milestone where you had to have big demos. And so that created a new crunch period before it. And it all started merging into being a year-round crunch. And that's when it just got really difficult. And when I was at EA, it was just an extension, but worse than for me, from my standpoint. And I'm being really brutally honest with you. I've been out of doing games actively for a while. So in a sense, I have nothing to lose, but I am being a little brutal. And other people might not see it quite as black as I saw it. But like I say, I came into the scene experienced in production. So I had a different viewpoint than some of these guys that came in at age 23 and they had, infinite energy and they had not yet been beaten up. They might have a different perspective than I do. And I'm not saying their perspective is wrong. I'm saying perspective is personal. And so I'm just giving you mine. So yeah, EA was, it was exciting and interesting to work there. They were a bigger company and they had other kinds of resources. And that was really fun and interesting. But again, the way that the projects were managed to me just seemed nuts. And I decided, I guess it's working for them, but it don't work for me. And after that, I got out of doing games for a while. I did some independent work, but I got out of doing it full time, and I went back into working in the audio industry instead. And you know, that was good. That was what I needed. It was fun and interesting.
So Julian Kwasniewski told me that you got him on board at EA because he also worked on this game.
Well,
Clint.
yeah, he was. What happened was, he and Clint left LucasArts, and they formed Bay Area Sound. Mm-hmm. And originally, Clint was going to be the president, and then Julian was going to be his partner. And then Clint got, I think it was the job at Sony, I think is what happened, fairly quickly. And so they talked about it, and Clint said, well, you know, I'm sorry to do this to you, to set you up and get this thing started and then run away, but I have to do this. You know, I've got a family. It's a great opportunity. And Julian said, that's cool. I'll take the ball and run with it. And he did. So he was running Bay Area Sound. And as I said, I could not get resources from another team at Electronic Arts, and I needed more resources because of all the reasons that I've explained about the production process. So I called Julian up and I said, I need you to do this, and I need you to quote me like a weekly rate. I think it was a weekly rate I asked for. And he gives me this rate, and he says, that's for 40 hours. And I said, no. You don't understand, because Julian was a close friend, right? I did not want to screw Julian. I was trying to give him work, but I didn't want to screw him. I said, you don't understand. I'm not going to bang you on price. I'm not going to try and knock your price down. I'm going to bang you on time. I'm going to be working you to the bone because that's what I need. So, you know, and he had been in business for himself that long, right? And he wasn't quite getting what I was trying to say. So I'm sitting there in a cubicle at EA, basically whispering so that nobody could hear me because I'd get fired if they did, telling Julian how to structure his contract so that I wouldn't screw him. So I was like, you know, look, you want to set it up this way for, you know, give me this rate for up to this many hours. And after that, go to an hourly at this rate. And, you know, and he's like, oh, okay, I see. And I'm like, okay, good. I cannot tell you anymore. You got to do this. And so that's how he ended up getting involved with it. And they did great work for me. I mean, he really wanted to make it work, and he did. You know, we'd worked together long enough that there was a lot that was known between us. He even knew, you know, some of my sonic aesthetic. So when I said, yeah, I'm looking for something that feels more like this and this, you know, then he was able to do it. But, you know, one of the things that was fun about being at EA was having the resources. For example, I went to Fantasy Studios and we did Foley. And we were able to, there's an opening scene where Bond has this whole fight and he's on top of a rooftop. And there's all this stuff getting smashed all over the place. And I was able to do Foley footsteps on broken glass. Because how are you going to get that out of a library? You know, it's hard to find glass footsteps in a library. So I hired a friend of mine that did Foley work. And we went to Fantasy. And we did Foley on all these different surfaces that I needed, including the broken glass. And that would have been much more difficult to do at LucasArts. We might have been able to go up to Skywalker. But, you know, Skywalker was more expensive. It was, I mean, truth to tell, George built Skywalker and then has hardly ever recorded any of his own orchestral music there because it's too expensive because of the unions. And so he goes to London and uses London Symphony Orchestra. So, you know, I did some stuff. In fact, I did some stuff for Bounty Hunter at Skywalker. One thing I did that was really fun and worked out great was I wanted to have some really interesting ship ambiances. And so I found a guy who had a 48-inch tam-tam, big gong. And we went to the scoring stage at Skywalker, and I put some microphones close to it, like at each corner and on each side, and some others further away. And then I played it with mallets, like all over the gong and louder and softer. And then I used that for the ambience so that because of the multiple mics and the way I played it, it would sort of move around and undulate and, you know, ululate throughout the space, which really made for a great sort of immersive, especially, you know, when any sort of surround and phase-based spatial thing, it worked really well. But other than that, we did not have the same kind of resources I could get at EA, like when we went and did the Foley. So, Yeah, Julian got involved, and Julian delivered a bunch of stuff for us. And then I also hired Dave Levison because when we went to do the music, there was a composer that I wanted to use, a guy named Jeff Rona. And at the time, Jeff had not really done much in the way of games. He'd done a lot of movies. I think he was interested in moving into games, but hadn't done much. And I wanted to hire him, but there was a guy much higher than me in the hierarchy who did music contracting. And he didn't want to use Jeff. I was supposed to be able to choose that because I was the audio director, but no. So he got this other guy who was a good composer. He had composed for the TV series 24, but he'd never done interactive. But this is the guy they wanted to use. So I had to fly to LA and try and give him a primer on how to write music for interactive media, because it's completely different than writing for linear media. You have to be able to write vertically and horizontally and know when to use which and write transitions. And, so I basically coached him on all of that, but he was not going to have any idea how to actually implement it. He was not that good with software. So I hired Dave Levison as the music programmer. And this composer did all the music, and then Dave came in and did all the programming. And a lot of that actually took place after I left. But I brought Dave in to do it, and then, then I left EA. It was a difficult time for working on big games. For me, anyway. Maybe not for other people.
So after your time at EA in 2003, you started working as a senior marketing writer at Mayer Sound Laboratories. What can you share about the 4 years you spent there?
Well, I was senior marketing writer. I was also communications manager for a while. I'd been working with them since the mid-'80s when I started writing. Actually, before I started writing, I had worked at a company called Pro Media, which ended up buying Ultrasound and becoming a large sound reinforcement company. At the time, they were also doing sound reinforcement, and they were using Meyer Sound for sound reinforcement and selling Meyer Sound. And this is pretty early in Meyer Sound's career. So I got to know John and Helen Meyer in like 83, about 4 years after they'd started the company. And so I started doing writing for them as of 84 or 85 and been doing contract writing that whole time. And Meyer Sound is a really interesting place. John Meyer is one of maybe 2 or 3 people in my life that I've met who I would actually apply the term genius to. And my definition of genius is there are people that are visionaries and there are people that are really brilliant, but the person that can take that vision and make it work in the real world, that's the genius. And that's what John did. And so I was always just amazed by his stuff. And, they don't call it Meyer Sound Laboratories for nothing. They take a very scientific and research-oriented approach. So when I started there, I was very familiar with the company. I was very familiar with the people. In fact, when I left EA, I had tried to get a headhunter to shop me around, and I'd spotted this opening at Meyer Sound. And I said, I know people there. You should approach them. And they didn't. And I said, okay, see you later. And I called Helen Meyer myself directly and went in and did an interview. And it's quite a remarkable company. It is every bit as remarkable in its field as LucasArts was in its field or is in its field. They pioneer these technologies and they patent them. And generally, they haven't brought patent infringement suits when people infringe on them. And then the technology they invent just becomes industry standard. Like if you go to sound reinforcement and you have a point source approach rather than a line array approach, you'll see this trapezoidal shaped box. Well, John Meyer patented that originally. Now everybody uses it. So there was just a lot of brilliant people working there, brilliant engineers, a lot of artists who just loved Meyer Sound stuff, and you'd sometimes come in contact with them. And that was a place where I was able to convey this whole idea that I'd mentioned about being at the cutting edge, because there was a new product that they were devising, and they came into the marketing department and they said, make us a brochure, and everybody set to work on it. And then the next day they came back and they said, well, actually, we've changed all this stuff. And a bunch of people in the department were frustrated. It's like, we busted our tails all day yesterday trying to get this done, and they've changed it all today. And that's when I had to explain, you're on the cutting edge. Nobody knows what they're doing. Things change. That's just the nature of it. You just have to learn how to ride the tiger. And whenever you're somewhere that's really innovating, you have to accept that the ground is going to shift under your feet. And you just got to learn how, if you fall down, you get back up, and you get better at keeping your feet when the ground is shifting. So working at Meyer Sound was a very, very exciting place to be because of the technical breakthroughs that happened there. And the period that I was there, John Meyer had resisted digital audio for years because he just didn't think it was up to the quality level. But the time I was there, he thought it finally had gotten to the quality level he wanted. And so they had bought a company called Level Control Systems, LCS. And LCS had been making these digital processing boxes for doing all sorts of spatial manipulation in live sound, multi-channel live sound. Really sophisticated stuff. They had a wonderful model where they would model space as a series of triangles, and you could, modulate how things moved around from these triangles. And so they developed a new system around that. And, as the writer, I didn't get direct contact with the technology that much, with the product that much, but I did with the technology. I got to work with the engineers and really, because as I already mentioned about my writing, I like to really, dive deep so that I can relate it accurately. So that was a very exciting period to be there and be involved in what was going on there. It's a very idiosyncratic place. It's a family-oriented place. They've never done things the way other people do. And so, there's its own brand of internal politics and, but it's an amazing place. I used to take media on tours. That was one of my favorite things, to take them on tours and show them, because John's attitude was, if I can't get something of the quality I need, I'm just going to learn to build it and do it in-house. And in the early days, they had bought drivers from Yamaha, and then they'd had to modify every single driver to get the performance they wanted. And only like 30% of the drivers they got would be usable. And he finally said, this is ridiculous. So he bought a machine, and now they make their own cones, their own paper cones with their own blend of paper. They manufacture their, the cones for the speakers. So it's a very interesting and highly innovative place. Yeah, I still love those folks.
In 2009, you started working as an audio director at Real Life Plus. What can you tell me about your work there?
That was interesting. That was, again, just a new thing that was starting to happen, which was a massively multiplayer online social game. It was not, like a fighter. It was a social game where you could wander around through different worlds and make friends, etc. And by this point, I had enough game experience that it was not that difficult for me to approach. I mean, obviously, work is work. There's still, if you want to be innovative. But the nice thing about it was a very small team. So I was literally doing all of the sound except for the voices. There weren't even that many voices, but I was doing all the music and all the sound design. I was designing it. I was creating it. I was implementing it, the whole thing. And that's nice. There's a unity that you can achieve. It's a lot of work, but there's a way that you can integrate things really nicely so you can make music and sound design that fit together in sort of a seamless way where sometimes you can't even tell which is which happens in film a lot, is you'll get film music that almost sounds like sound design. So that particular game ended up not really, taking off. It was a good team of people, and it was a good opportunity to work with this whole, online, massively multiplayer online sort of approach.
In 2015, you became the first person to earn a degree through Berklee Online. What can you share about this tremendous achievement?
Well, back in the 70s, I first started school at State University of New York at Albany. Then I went to Berklee College, and I was there when it was only on campus. There was no online in the mid-70s. There was only basically 2 buildings. They added a third. They added the Berklee Performance Center. There's now 27 to 30 Berklee buildings, something like that. The time there were 2 or 3. What was a very common thing to have happen at Berklee is people would come, they would get some education, and then they'd get a gig. And they'd never finish their degree. They'd go off and do the gig. And this was a very common thing. So common that they had decided to create a program for just such people who decided that they wanted to finish their degree. And I had been contacted by a guy named David Mash. Now, Dave Mash had become one of the biggest figures in synthesis and teaching, in the world, because he really built up the Berklee program. I met Dave my first semester at Berkeley. He had graduated the previous semester, and it was his first semester as a teacher. And that's when we met. So, we had known each other for years, and we had done stuff together way back when. So he was doing a tour and rounding up a bunch of different Berkeley alumni to talk about a vision for Berkeley going forward for the next, 5, 6, 10 years. And he wanted me to come to this meeting. So I came to this meeting, and I'm sitting next to him waiting for the meeting to start, and we're chatting. And I told him that I had gotten laid off from my job and had decided to go back to school, and had run into a few different problems going back to school and was just trying to finish it and get a degree. And Dave looks at me and he says, "You know what? We have a program for you. We built it for you." And he told me about this program that I was just describing to you that had not yet been launched for online degrees. And so I said, "Yeah, that sounds perfect. I'd love to do that." At this point, Dave was like a vice president at Berkeley. And he was kind of, his career was coming to its close in a few years. He was close to retirement. And so he got me into this program. And because I had a lot of college credits already, I had done 5 years of college back in the 70s, and then another year and a half or 2 years more recently. And plus I had an entire career, and they were able to give me credits for life experience as long as I wrote it up. And of course, I was a writer. So I did a great job writing it up. And so in the end, I only had to take a half dozen courses in order to complete the whole thing and get my degree. And so I did those half dozen courses and became the first graduate from Berkeley Online. And I decided after all these years and all this effort that I should actually go walk the plank, as it were. And so I flew to Boston, and I had my 80-year-old mom come out also because she'd been paying for a lot of this college. And she'd been sitting there for years going, "I wish he'd finish his degree." And she got to see me walk across the stage and get handed that degree. And it was that was very satisfying. And then about 2 weeks after the graduation and after I got back, I went, "Wow, I finally did it. I got a degree." And I pulled it out to look at it again. And that was the first time I spotted that on the degree it said summa cum laude. Nobody even bothered to mention to me that I graduated with honors. So I just, looked at it, and that's what it said, and it was amazing. The other thing I was going to say that was kind of nice was when I sent in my justifications for life experience credits, and they came back and they said, "This is the best we've ever gotten like this. This is just beyond what everybody else does. Do you mind if we show it to some of the other students?" And like a true writer-editor, I said, "Let me do one more edit on it, and then sure." So I ran one more edit on it and let them have it. And then they presumably have used it and showed it to other students.
It's interesting to hear that your credits from the 70s didn't expire.
Yeah.
Like they rolled over to the 2015.
Actually, there's another story behind that that's even better, which is, remember I told you I went to night school at MIT, to Lowell Institute?
Yeah.
Well, that was not actually a degree-granting institution. They had professional certificates. But I thought that would help out. So I went to try and find out about those credits. And it turns out that in the interim, Lowell Institute School had moved from MIT to Northeastern. And it was now a degree-granting part of Northeastern. So I called Northeastern, and I called the bursar's office or whatever, and said, "Hey, I wonder if I can get a letter, attesting to these credits." And the woman that was in charge of the bursar's office couldn't find anything about it. And she said, "Look, if you can ever find any proof, if you can find the actual certificate you got, then I'll make this happen." And I said, "Okay." A few months went by, and I one day just happened to come across the actual certificate. So I sent it to her, and I said, "Here it is. Here's the certificate. And now, can I get that letter from you?" And she's like, "Oh, well, okay, let me see what I can do." And she went through all their records and couldn't find anything. And she called me up and she said, "I'm sorry, I can't find anything." And I'm like, "You promised me that if I found the certificate, you could do it." And something in her pride, she was like, obviously the queen of the department. And she was like, "Okay, this shall not stand." And so she said, "Let me work on it." And she put on her Indiana Jones hat and she went downstairs to a closet. This is literal. She went to a closet And in that closet, there were boxes of records that she'd gotten from the old Lowell Institute school. And it turns out for one term only, they had used a particular system of orange cards that they tracked everything on. And she finds this box of orange cards and she digs through this box till she finds my records. And then she sends me a letter with them as accredited credits, because now Lowell Institute School is part of an accredited part of Northeastern. So I actually gained accredited credits from way back when. So yeah, it was amazing that they hadn't expired. But I had like 200 credits from before. I mean, your typical degree takes almost about half that, essentially.
Yeah, but usually credits expire after 7 years, 8 years, 10 years. It's been 4 decades.
Yeah. I wasn't going to argue with them. I wasn't going to argue with them. They accepted them. So,
In 2015, you also started working as a producer at Ears Here Now. What can you share about your time there?
Well, that's kind of fun. That's this storytelling meets sound art series that I did. And originally I started off to make a production demo to get audio production gigs. And I wanted something that would show off all my skills: writing, voiceover, music composition, audio engineering, production. I wanted to show it all off, sound design. And so I was looking for what I could do in terms of stories. Well, as I said, I went back to school. And one of the things that the biggest thing I'd lacked had been general education credits. So I had taken an English course at a place called Napa Valley College nearby. And I had written a story for that English course, a true story, something that had happened to me that I talked about earlier when I talked about the out-of-body experience. So I wrote that up as a story, which I called Out of Body, Out of Mind. I decided this would be perfect for a production demo: rock and roll and a biker bar and a surreal experience. This is perfect. So I start working on this demo and I get maybe 3 days in, really not very far. And I suddenly go, I think I'm onto something here. I think there's something more here than just a demo. And so I just kept working on this idea. And the idea, I tend to work from the right brain first, intuitively. And then later on, I bring in the analytical side and say, well, that was cool. What the heck is it? And I look at what I did. So I finished this whole thing. And when I went back and looked at it, I realized that what I had done was, generally with storytelling, the story is told pretty exclusively through the narration. And then there'll be a handful of sound effects just to kind of emphasize or illustrate something. And there'll be music to kind of carry the mood. But what I had done was I had integrated the music and the sound design much more closely, to the point where at moments, the music or the sound design might be the thing that moves the narrative forward rather than the narration. Not often, but once in a while. Most of the time they serve their supportive roles, but sometimes they'd step forward and give you information that you were not getting from the narration. And it just worked really well. I thought it worked well. So then I decided, okay, well, I need to get a reality check on this. I think it's good. Does anybody else? So I started looking for festivals. Well, none of the podcasting festivals or anything like that didn't look like they wanted anything like what I had done. And I found one festival, which coincidentally was called the Here Now Festival. I was already calling the series Ears Here Now. And they looked like they had a broader, a bigger tent. And so I submitted to them. And they took it as a platinum selection. And I went to the festival, and the festival was great. And I thought, okay, well, these people listen to this stuff all the time. They thought I was good enough to be a platinum selection. I guess I should, go for it. And so I did the second piece, The Incident, also a true story. This was about when my wife and I were coming back from walking the dog on Mare Island, which is near me here. Mare Island was a naval shipyard for 140 years, since before the American Civil War up until the mid-90s, when there was a big wave of base closures, and the thing completely closed down. And we had been walking the dog down there because it's no longer a military base. And while we're driving back, we suddenly wake up in the emergency room. And it turns out some guy had pulled an armed carjacking, was making a high-speed getaway at like 80 miles an hour, ran a red light, and T-boned our car. We never saw him coming. And we basically walked away from it. I got a concussion. My wife still gets dizzy once in a while, but pretty much we walked away from it. We never saw it coming. It was very weird. And this contrasted with another experience I'd had years before coming back from a concert where I'd stopped to get some food at a diner that sat way back from an intersection. And we had just ordered, and I heard this weird noise, and I look out the window and I see a car sitting at a weird angle and a guy on his hands and knees crawling across, and a little sports car at going about 45 miles an hour coming directly at the table we were sitting at. And I got one look into that car. And meanwhile, no one else in the restaurant has seen anything. Nobody knows anything has happened. I'm the only one that's noticed this. And I saw into the car, and I saw the driver was out of it. The passenger, this woman, was like screaming her head off and all that. And it was such a contrast that I was the only person that saw what happened there. And then in this other crash, we never saw it coming. So I did a whole half-hour piece on the incident about that. And it's actually, I think, some of the best work I've ever done. So then I submitted that to the Here Now Festival, and they took that as a platinum selection also. So I am right now working on what will be the third installment, which is somewhat different. I have a music album that I've been working on for years, and I had titled the album This Side of the Veil. And the purpose of that is that the veil is a symbol that's been used for a long time in a lot of cultures for the barrier, the sometimes diaphanous barrier between this life and whatever comes after this life, whatever that may be. And so I had this sort of insight that there are many ways of looking at life, but one that people often don't sort of see is the day-to-day experience, which feels very episodic. This happens, then this happens, then this happens. And those things are connected, if by nothing else, by you know, but sometimes by other things. But it often feels like life is just one thing after another. And that's sort of what the songs on the album were. Each one was a slice of life. But I realized there was nothing on the album that really expressed that directly or indirectly. So I decided to do a title tune called This Side of the Veil, which is kind of a dumb idea because it had taken me decades to get these songs done, and now they were done. But instead of putting them out, I'm going to do another. But dumb wasn't enough for me. I went to full on stupid. And I decided instead of writing a song, I commissioned a friend to write a poem. And I explained the sensibility I was trying to express. I played her the music, and she comes back with a 5-page epic, 16 stanzas. And I'm like, be careful what you ask for. So I've been working on that for months, and I'm doing it in 2 passes. The first pass, this is like a traditional classical composition method, where the first pass is principal composition, and the second pass is orchestration. In this case, orchestration is development and refinement. And so just, a couple weeks ago, I finished the first pass, principal composition, which was huge because before that, I mean, scoring a poem with music and sound design, there isn't a roadmap for that. There's not established things like verses and choruses and bridges to work with, or established forms like in classical, like rondo form or, sonata form. That doesn't exist. So it was the biggest blank page syndrome you can imagine. And so when I finally got that first pass done, it was a huge milestone. And now I'm basically doing all the organization and gearing up to do the second pass, which hopefully I can get done in a month or 2, maybe a little optimistic. And that will be the third Ears Here Now release, as well as the title tune for the album. So, and I have other things planned after that, other, true stories and not true stories. But it's been very interesting because I haven't found anybody else who's really doing the same thing, melding the music and the sound design and the narration. And that always makes life rougher because there isn't a road to follow, but it also makes it richer because you're not copying anybody else. You're doing something. It's the same thing I've been saying all along about making it up as you go along when you're innovating. And so Ears Here Now is really about that, about finding a new approach to melding music, sound design, and storytelling.
So this is hopefully coming out in late September, early October.
Yeah, that might be optimistic. I would like that, but certainly before the end of the year. Yeah, so if it comes, I'll let you know. It's been a big project, and it's been the whole thing of having this 5-page poem and not knowing how to proceed is harrowing. And, this is another thing that you learn about such projects. The only way to do it is you just plunge in and do something. And if it's terrible and it's stupid and ridiculous, then you throw it out. But at least you have a little momentum. And the momentum is the more important part. Because once you have some momentum, if you're any good and if you're trying, you're going to start getting a grasp on something and you're going to start making some progress. So I've had a lot of that of like, just do something. Doesn't matter how stupid and terrible it is. You can always throw it out and start over again. But at least you get something on that blank page. So this whole piece has been an exercise in that. But now it's defined and it's just a matter of filling everything in. And it's kind of exciting.
In my conversation with Julian, he told me that whenever someone would ask you, what do you do for a living? You would reply with, during the day, I do all the things that prevent me from doing the thing that I do for a living. Do you still feel that way nowadays?
Well, yes, in a sense, that's what I was saying before about if you want to have fun, you have to start off by having no fun, doing the things that aren't fun. That's kind of what I meant when I was saying that is like you spend all day taking care of business and organization and all the things that really, aren't much fun in order to set yourself up to be able to have fun when you work at night. And if you don't do that, it just, they stop you cold, those things. And I hate that. I hate being in the creative flow and then being stopped cold. That's, that's not what life is for.
Now, before we conclude our conversation, one final question from me. You just told us what your plans for the rest of 2024 are, but what are your plans for 2025 and how can people stay in touch with you and your work?
Well, my website is probably the best way to stay in touch. It really badly needs an overhaul, which it will get before very long at all once I get this album done. And that is at toysintheattic.org, not .com, .org. Toys in the Attic, TOYSINTHEATTIC.org. As for my plans, I'm going to finish this album. I'm going to release it as an Ears Here Now piece as well as the album. I'm going to probably try and do a lot more music, put a band together to play the album. I also have another act I do called Vibrafolk, which is a solo vibraphone and vocals act. I do what I call progressive folk music. I have yet to find any other singing vibists. And my last gig playing that was right before the pandemic, like days before everything shut down. So it's about time for me to get back to that. I have a lot more Ears Here Now stuff to do. I have money work that I do that people aren't going to be that interested to hear about. Things that you do just to make money that aren't creative. But probably creatively, it's going to be Ears Here Now. The album is coming out under the band name Ziba Neba, and I will probably be trying to put together an actual performing band, Ziba Neba, and Vibrafolk. And those will probably be my three biggest focuses in 2025.
Wow, sounds awesome.
I have a lot going on. It's, I take on big projects and then I just chip away at them really slowly. This is the last piece I will give you is persistence is everything. And persistence doesn't mean you never stop. It means you don't quit. There are times when you'll get stopped, but you restart and you just keep doing that. Every time you get stopped, you restart. And sooner or later, you actually do get to the end.
Well, you're a man who likes to follow through on what you start.
Indeed, I do. Daniel, I cannot tell you what a complete delight this is, not simply because I get to sit here for 2 or 3 hours and babble about myself.
Or 4.
But oh my God. But I really do just love what you do going into this level of depth. In talking to people, you talk to a lot of people and you just do the deep dive all the way down to the bottom of the pool. And there's so few people, probably really nobody else is doing it the way that you're doing it. And I stumbled on your stuff by accident because you were posting things you did with a few friends of mine. And I started checking it out. And as I think I said at the very beginning, it's just so rich. And I truly love what you're doing. And I'm I cannot tell you how tickled pink I am to have been part of it.
Well, thank you so much for the kind words, and I'm humbled to hear that you actually enjoyed these conversations. And thank you so much for joining me for a conversation today. It's truly been a blast talking to you about your illustrious career.
Yeah. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Larry.